Close your eyes and step backward through time. It's January, the year 1347, and you're standing inside a castle in northern England. It's 2 in the morning. The fire in the hearth has gone out. Not sputtered. Not dimmed to embers you could coax back to life. Gone. Dead. Cold ash where flame used to be. And it will stay that way until sunrise. The darkness around you isn't like any darkness you've ever known. There are no streetlights bleeding through windows. No glow from a neighboring building. No phone screen. No clock display. No pilot light from a distant hallway. Nothing. The kind of black that feels solid, that presses against your eyes, that makes you uncertain whether they're open or closed. You hear wind. It moves through the corridors like something alive, finding cracks in the stone you didn't know existed, moaning through arrow slits, cut into walls 15 feet thick. Occasionally, something creaks in the distance. Wood contracting. A door shifting on iron hinges. Sounds that in daylight mean nothing, but in this darkness feel like warnings. Then there's the cold. This isn't the cold of forgetting to adjust your thermostat. This isn't waking up slightly chilly and pulling another blanket over yourself. This is cold that climbs through the stone floor into your feet, that wraps around your ankles like hands made of ice. Your breath comes out in clouds that you can't see, but can feel drifting back against your face. The stone walls around you, those massive fortifications that keep enemies out. They aren't providing shelter now. They're radiating cold inward. The castle has become a stone box designed to preserve winter. You reach out in the darkness and touch the wall. It feels like touching the side of a frozen well. Your hand recoils instinctively. And somewhere in this building, in rooms scattered across multiple floors, dozens of people are trying to sleep. Not trying to survive until morning. Trying to actually sleep. Close their eyes, lose consciousness, and wake up rested enough to work the next day. They have to do this tonight, tomorrow night, every night until spring arrives, maybe 4 months away. The fire dies at midnight. In a modern home, you'd wake up uncomfortable by 3 in the morning, stumble to the thermostat, fix the problem. In a medieval castle, if you woke up at 3 in the morning, you might not wake up again at all. Yet somehow, they didn't die. They survived. Night after night, winter after winter, their entire lives. History books tell us about medieval battles and kings and political intrigue. They describe the 100 Years' War and the Black Death and the construction of cathedrals. But they rarely mention this. The fact that medieval people spent roughly 40% of their lives in various states of cold darkness. 40%. Nearly half of existence happening in conditions that would kill most modern people within hours. How did they sleep? Not just endure. Not just stay alive until dawn, but actually rest. Actually recover enough to function. Actually close their eyes in environments that seem designed to prevent exactly that. This isn't a question about comfort. It's a question about survival. And the answer has been hiding in plain sight for 700 years, scattered across archaeological sites and forgotten household records and the bones themselves. Somewhere in the gap between what we think we know about medieval life and what actually happened, there's knowledge we've lost. Techniques and technologies and ways of thinking that allowed human beings to do something that seems impossible. But before we can understand how they survived these nights, we need to understand something crucial. Medieval castles weren't designed to be lived in. They were designed to be defended. And that single fact changed everything about sleep. Picture a medieval castle the way most people do. Stone walls, tapestries, a massive fireplace with flames roaring against the cold. Maybe some fur throws. It looks cozy in films. Romantic, even. Now erase that image completely. The men who built these structures were geniuses, masters of their craft. They understood load-bearing physics before the mathematics existed to describe it. They knew how to raise walls that could withstand battering rams and catapults. They designed murder holes and matriculations and arrow loops, calculated to give defenders every possible advantage. Medieval masons knew exactly how to keep their lords safe from arrows and siege weapons. But they had no idea they were building structures that would wage a different kind of war. One fought every single night against their own bodies. Because castles weren't homes that happened to be defensible. They were fortifications that people happened to live in. And every single design choice reflected that priority. Take the walls. 8 to 15 feet thick in most castles. Some even thicker. Excellent for stopping projectiles. Impossible for heat to penetrate. The stone absorbed cold from the winter air outant and radiated it inward, turning interior rooms into chambers carved from ice. The thermal mass that made castles bearable in summer, that pleasant cool you'd feel even in July, became a death sentence in January. The windows tell the same story. Narrow, vertical slits, arrow loops, designed so a defender could shoot out while presenting almost no target to shoot back at. Brilliant military architecture. But these openings couldn't be sealed properly. Medieval people tried. They stuffed them with cloth, with wood, with whatever they had. It didn't matter. Wind found its way through. Every window was a wound in the building's skin that never healed. Then there were the staircases, spiral, clockwise going up, built that way deliberately so that attackers climbing the stairs would have their sword arms against the central column, unable to swing effectively, while defenders coming down would have full range of motion. Tactically perfect. But spiraling stone staircases create something else. Vertical wind tunnels. Cold air sinks, gets channeled through these stone corkscrews, accelerates. Every staircase became a chimney for cold, drawing frigid air from the upper floors down through the entire structure. And the great halls, those vast open spaces where lords held court and hosted feasts. Ceilings 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet high. Impressive, imposing, completely impossible to heat. Even if you built a fire in the center of the room, and they did, massive fires, the heat rose straight up into that empty volume and vanished. You could be standing 10 feet from a roaring fire and still see your breath. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew this was happening. Private letters survive. Personal journals. A 14th century account from a castle in Scotland describes trying to write with ink that kept freezing in the bottle. A French noble wrote to his brother complaining that water left in his chamber overnight froze solid as if kept in a cellar of ice. These weren't people accepting their fate in silence. They were trapped inside architectural decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with their comfort. You'd think the fireplaces would help. The massive hearths you see in Texel remains. Some of them large enough to walk into. Surely those generated enough heat to matter. They didn't. The same chimneys that prevented smoke from killing everyone also siphoned away nearly all the heat. Modern thermal analysis of medieval fireplace designs shows that perhaps 70 to 80% of the heat went straight up and out. What remained radiated a few feet outward. Stand close and you'd burn. Step back and you'd freeze. There's documentation of people scorching their fronts while their backs went numb from cold. So the architecture was working against them. Stone walls that trapped cold instead of keeping it out. Windows that couldn't seal. Staircases that pumped frigid air through the building like a circulatory system. Rooms too vast to heat. Fireplaces that consumed fuel but provided almost no warmth. But there's something else you need to know. Something that changes the entire equation. The fires that did exist weren't just dying randomly. They were required by law to go out. There's a law from medieval Europe that almost no one talks about today, yet it governed the lives of millions of people for centuries. It's called curfew. You've heard the word before, probably in connection with teenagers staying out too late, or martial law in occupied cities. But the original curfew had nothing to do with people wandering the streets. It was about fire. The word itself comes from Old French, couvre-feu, cover fire. And that's exactly what it meant. Every evening, somewhere between 8 and 9 o'clock, a bell would ring across the town or village. That bell wasn't calling people to prayer or marking the hour. It was a command. By law, you had to extinguish or heavily dampen every fire in your home. Every candle. Every hearth flame in your bedroom. Every ember that provided warmth in your living space. Only fires in specific locations, like communal kitchens or certain halls, were allowed to burn through the night. This wasn't a suggestion. It was enforced. It was the law. The reason was simple and terrifying. Fire was the #1 threat to medieval communities. Entire cities were built from wood. Roofs were thatched with dry straw. Houses stood inches apart, their upper floors leaning so close across narrow streets that neighbors could touch hands from opposite windows. If one house caught fire, the whole block could be engulfed in minutes. The whole city could burn in hours. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is the famous example everyone knows. 4 days of inferno, 13,000 houses destroyed. But here's what most people don't realize. That wasn't unusual. It was just the most documented. Fires like that happened constantly throughout medieval Europe. Basel burned, Rennes burned. Moscow burned repeatedly. In 1135, the city of London had already burned once before. Fire wasn't a rare catastrophe. It was an ever-present predator, stalking every community, waiting for one careless moment. So authorities made a choice. They decided that controlled, predictable cold was better than uncontrolled. Apocalyptic fire. They passed laws. They enforced them. And every night, when that bell rang, people had to extinguish their warmth. Medieval writings describe this ritual in matter-of-fact terms that somehow make it more chilling. The sound of the bell, the systematic dampening of flames, the psychological preparation for what was coming. They didn't complain about it the way we might. They simply described it as part of the evening routine, the way you might describe brushing your teeth before bed. Except their routine ended with mandatory cold. Imagine if tonight, right now, a bell rang and you were legally required to turn off all heat in your home until sunrise. That wasn't a nightmare scenario for medieval people. That was Tuesday. That was Thursday. That was every single night of their lives. We think of camping in the cold as an adventure, something we prepare for with special gear and mental readiness. For them, it wasn't occasional, it was default. They had a completely different relationship with fire, with darkness, with sleep itself. Every evening required the same psychological shift we might make before spending a night outdoors in winter. Except they did it in their own beds, in their own homes, with their children beside them. By now, you're probably thinking, they must have frozen to death constantly. And you'd be partly right. But here's where the story gets interesting. The ones who survived, and most of them did survive, knew something we've completely forgotten. What if I told you that medieval people didn't fight the cold? They built tiny fortresses to hide from it. And you could sleep in one tonight for 8 hours and wake up comfortable in a room where your breath freezes. That sounds impossible. But it's not theory, it's engineering. And the technology that made it possible is something we've completely abandoned in the modern world, even though it worked flawlessly for centuries. We're talking about the medieval bed. But you need to forget everything you think a bed is. This wasn't furniture. It was architecture. It was survival equipment. It was the result of generations of trial and error, refined by people who understood that getting this wrong meant death. The great beds of medieval households were enormous. 8 feet by 8 feet wasn't uncommon for a wealthy family. The frame was solid wood, built like a piece of permanent architecture rather than something you'd move. In fact, many of these beds weren't moved. They were built into the room itself, sometimes for decades. But the frame was just the skeleton. The real innovation was what surrounded it. Heavy curtains, thick wool in common households, velvet or tapestry fabric in wealthy ones. These curtains enclosed the bed completely on all sides. Front, back, both ends, floor to canopy. When you climbed into bed and drew those curtains closed, you weren't just getting under covers. You were sealing yourself inside a separate chamber, a room within the room. Now here's what most people miss when they see these beds in museums or movies. They think the curtains were decorative, something to create privacy or look impressive. But that's completely wrong. Those curtains were survival technology. They were doing something extremely specific, something based on physics that medieval people understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain it in modern terms. When you seal yourself inside a fabric enclosure with another human body, or 2 or 6, something remarkable happens. Your body heat doesn't escape into the vast cold room. It stays trapped in that small space. The fabric itself creates what we now call dead air space. Multiple feet of it. That's one of the best insulators in existence. The air between your body and the curtain warms up. The air between the inner and outer fabric layers, if the curtains were lined, warms up. And crucially, that warm air stays contained. It doesn't rise into the cathedral ceiling of your bedroom. It doesn't get sucked out through the gaps around the window shutters. It stays with you. Modern researchers have actually tested this. They've built replica medieval beds and put thermal imaging cameras in rooms set to freezing temperatures. The results are startling. Inside those closed curtains, with 2 or 3 people sleeping, the temperature rises 20 to 30 degrees above the ambient room temperature. Think about that. The room is 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough that water left in a cup overnight would freeze. But inside the curtains, It's 55 or even 65 degrees. That's not comfortable by our standards, but it's survivable. It's sleepable. It's the difference between hypothermia and rest. Medieval people knew this worked because they tested it every single night for their entire lives. And they valued these beds accordingly. When you read medieval wills, which list everything a person owned at death, beds appear again and again among the most valuable possessions. Not just mentioned, valued. Sometimes a bed was worth more than livestock, more than land, more than family heirlooms. There are records of beds being fought over in divorce proceedings with the same intensity as modern couples fighting over houses. There are inventories where a bed with its full set of curtains, linens, and mattresses was itemized in extraordinary detail, describing every fabric layer, every curtain panel, every tie and fastening. Because this wasn't just furniture. This was survival infrastructure. Wealthy medieval households understood thermal engineering better than we give them credit for. They couldn't heat a castle. That was impossible with the technology available. Stone walls 10 feet thick. Windows that were essentially holes in those walls, covered at best with oiled cloth or very expensive glass that didn't seal properly. Fireplaces that sucked more heat up the chimney than they radiated into the room. They knew they couldn't control the macro environment, so they didn't try. Instead, they focused all their engineering intelligence on creating microclimates, tiny zones of warmth around the human body. The bed was the primary technology for that goal. Everything else was secondary. And here's what's fascinating from a modern perspective. We've gone in completely the opposite direction. We heat entire houses to 72 degrees so we can sleep under a single thin sheet. We pump heat into rooms we're not even using. We've treated the temperature problem by brute forcing the environment rather than adapting our immediate surroundings. Medieval people would find that absolutely baffling. Why would you try to heat a room? Heat the bed. Heat the body. Let the room stay cold. It's more efficient. It's more effective. And if you do it right, it works perfectly. But the bed frame and curtains were just the foundation. What happened inside those curtains, the layers, the materials, the arrangements, that's where the real survival science began. Medieval people slept under what essentially amounted to 40 to 60 pounds of fabric and fur. Not for comfort, for survival. And there was a specific order to those layers. Get it wrong and you might not wake up. This wasn't superstition. It was applied thermal science, developed over generations of cold nights, refined by families who learned the hard way what worked and what failed. When we look at medieval bedding through an archaeological lens, treating each layer like evidence at a dig site, we start to see something remarkable. These beds were engineered systems. Every material choice had a purpose. Every layer served a specific function. And the people who built them understood heat retention at an intuitive level that would impress modern survival experts. Start at the bottom. The bed frame itself was raised 2 to 3 feet off the floor. Always. This wasn't about status or comfort. It was about physics. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. In a stone-floored medieval bedroom with no heating, the coldest air in the room pooled at ground level. Sleeping on the floor would mean sleeping in a layer of air that could be 10 or 15 degrees colder than the air just 3 feet up. So beds were elevated. The frame created a platform that lifted sleepers into relatively warmer air. It's the same reason modern survival guides tell you never to sleep directly on cold ground when camping. Medieval people didn't need a guide. They learned it by necessity. On top of that frame, the first mattress. Usually straw or reeds, packed thick and replaced seasonally. This layer was insulation from below, creating dead airspace between the sleeper and the wooden slats of the bed frame. Straw is an excellent insulator when dry. It traps air in thousands of tiny pockets between the stalks. Medieval people knew that keeping this layer dry was critical, which is why they replaced it regularly and sometimes aired it out during dry periods. Above the straw, a wool-stuffed mattress, 3 to 4 inches thick in wealthier households. Wool is one of nature's perfect insulators. It retains heat even when damp, unlike most materials. It breathes, allowing moisture to escape rather than trapping it against the skin. And it compresses under body weight, conforming to the shape of the sleeper, which eliminates cold air gaps. Then came the sheets. This is where the sophistication really shows. Medieval people used linen sheets directly against the skin. Not because linen is warm, it's not, but because linen wicks moisture away from the body. When you sleep, you sweat, even in cold conditions. If that moisture stays trapped against your skin, it cools through evaporation and you lose body heat rapidly. Linen pulls that moisture away, keeping the skin relatively dry. Over the linen, wool blankets. Multiple wool blankets. In a typical well-off medieval household, 6 to 12 blankets was standard. Each one weighed 8 to 12 pounds. These weren't the thin decorative throws we use today. These were dense, felted wool, sometimes woven so tightly they were nearly windproof, and they were layered progressively through the season. As winter deepened, more blankets were added. Medieval household accounts show families pulling additional blankets from storage in December and January, then putting them back in spring. On the very top, fur, bearskin, sheepskin, rabbit pelts sewn together, whatever was available depending on social class and region. Fur served as the final seal. It's wind-resistant. It traps a layer of air in the guard hairs, and it's heavy, which presses all the layers beneath it into contact, eliminating gaps where heat could escape. The order of these layers wasn't random. It was a system. Linen against skin for moisture management. Wool in the middle for insulation. Fur on top for wind resistance and weight. Each material did what it did best. Stack them correctly, and they worked together to create a thermal envelope around the sleeping body. Peasants couldn't afford 12 wool blankets and bearskin coverlets, but they understood the same principles. They used what they had. Animal pelts from livestock, dried grass or heather stuffed into fabric casings, old wool clothing layered between rougher outer fabrics. The materials were cheaper, coarser, less refined, but the strategy was identical. Multiple layers, different materials serving different functions, elevation of the cold floor. The physics didn't care whether your blanket cost a year's wages or was made from last season's wool scraps. It worked the same. Modern researchers have tested this system. They've recreated medieval bedding in controlled environments and measured the thermal retention. The results confirm what medieval people knew from experience. A properly layered medieval bed with no external heat source could maintain human body temperature through a freezing night. The retained body heat, trapped by the layers and held inside the curtained enclosure, was enough. 40 to 60 pounds of carefully ordered fabric and fur could keep you alive and sleeping in a room where water froze in cups. These layers created a microenvironment, but they had one critical requirement: a heat source. And that heat source wasn't fire. Your body is a furnace. Right now, as you read this, you're producing roughly 100 watts of heat. That's the same output as a standard incandescent light bulb, the kind that warms your hand when you hold it close. You've been generating this heat every moment of your life, awake or asleep, without thinking about it. Medieval people thought about it constantly. 2 people sleeping together produce 200 watts of continuous heat. 4 people generate 400 watts. That's comparable to a small space heater, running all night long, producing no smoke, requiring no fuel, never going out. The mathematics were simple. The solution was elegant. The human body became the primary heating technology of the medieval bedroom. This wasn't about affection or social bonding, though those might have been pleasant side effects. This was thermal engineering. Medieval sleeping arrangements reflected a sophisticated understanding of heat conservation that we've completely forgotten. Married couples shared beds, obviously, but children slept with parents well into adolescence. Servants slept with household members. Guests shared beds with hosts. Travelers at inns shared beds with complete strangers. What shocks modern sensibilities was utterly unremarkable in medieval contexts. The documentary evidence is everywhere once you start looking. Travel accounts from the period discuss sleeping arrangements with the same casual tone you might use to describe checking into a hotel. A merchant traveling through France mentions sharing a bed with 2 other men at an inn, then moves on to discuss the quality of the morning meal. A pilgrim's diary notes that the monastery dormitory was warm despite the snow outside, thanks to 20 monks sleeping in close quarters. There's no embarrassment in these accounts, no sense of violation, just practical observation. We struggle with this because our culture has built elaborate frameworks around privacy, personal space, and bodily autonomy. These are valuable concepts, certainly, but they're also historically specific. Medieval people operated under different frameworks. Physical proximity didn't carry the same psychological weight. The boundaries we consider essential simply didn't exist in the same way. They couldn't afford to exist. Consider the physics from their perspective. A large bedroom in winter, even with a fire burning in the hearth, might maintain a temperature barely above freezing once the fire died down. Your breath would fog. Frost might form on the inside of the windows. Now add 4 people to that room, all generating heat, all pressed together under layers of wool and fur. The temperature under those covers could rise 20 or 30 degrees. Suddenly, survival becomes possible. The phrase "sleep tight" probably originated in this era. Yes, rope bed frames needed regular tightening to maintain support. But those tight quarters, those compressed sleeping arrangements, were equally part of the saying's meaning. People slept tight against each other because the alternative was freezing. Here's what the records rarely mention explicitly, because it was so obvious it didn't need saying. Solitary sleeping was dangerous. A person alone, even with proper bedding, even in a room with a hearth, might not survive a particularly brutal winter night. The fuel runs out. The fire dies. Your body's 100 watts aren't enough to heat the space around you. By morning, you've succumbed to hypothermia in your own bed. Community sleeping wasn't a cultural preference. It wasn't about lacking privacy or living in cramped conditions. It was about converting human bodies into a heating system, sophisticated enough to survive the European winter. 4 light bulbs in an insulated box, burning all night long. They just had to get comfortable with the fact that those light bulbs were people. But knowing you needed to share body heat and actually making it through the night are 2 different things. Because even with all these preparations, even with the perfect bed and multiple people, there was still the matter of breathing. Every night, medieval people played a game. The rules were simple, but the stakes were absolute. Seal yourself too tightly inside your bed enclosure and you'd gain precious warmth, but the air would slowly turn toxic. Leave gaps for ventilation and cold would flood in, negating everything you'd carefully constructed. Get the balance wrong for a few hours, and you'd wake up either gasping or shivering. Get it wrong badly enough, and you might not wake up at all. Most people today have never experienced truly oxygen-depleted sleep. We have ventilation systems we don't even notice. Air moves through our homes constantly, replacing itself, maintaining quality, without our awareness or effort. We take for granted that the air we breathe at 3 in the morning will be essentially identical to the air we breathed when we went to sleep. Medieval people had no such luxury. Inside those enclosed beds, with curtains drawn tight, with multiple bodies generating heat and consuming oxygen, with layers of fabric blocking air exchange, the atmosphere would deteriorate rapidly. 4 people breathing in a confined space, hour after hour, exhaling carbon dioxide that had nowhere to go. The concentration would build slowly, imperceptibly, while everyone slept. By morning, the air inside those curtains could be significantly depleted of oxygen and heavy with CO2. They woke up with crushing headaches, grogginess that lasted hours, nausea, dizziness, sometimes worse. Medieval medical texts describe these symptoms extensively, proposing elaborate cures involving specific herbs, bloodletting, prayers to particular saints. The physicians were sophisticated observers, documenting what they saw with remarkable precision. But they didn't understand the underlying cause. How could they? The chemistry of respiration wouldn't be understood for centuries. What they did understand, through trial and error and accumulated folk wisdom, was that certain practices helped. Strategic gaps in the bed curtains, positioned to allow minimal air circulation without creating devastating cold drafts. These weren't large openings, perhaps just a hand's width at the bottom. Another small gap near the top where warm air could escape and pull fresh air in from below. The thermal barrier remained mostly intact, but air could move, however slowly. Bed placement mattered enormously. Position your bed too far from any ventilation and you'd suffocate in your own exhalations. Too close to a window or vent and you'd freeze. The ideal location was near, but not directly adjacent to, small openings in walls that allowed some air exchange. These weren't the windows we'd recognize. Often they were tiny apertures, sometimes fitted with oiled cloth or thin scraped horn that let in light while blocking wind. But they allowed enough airflow to matter. The most ingenious solution was timing. Many households didn't fully close bed curtains until several hours into the night, after body heat had built up sufficient warmth inside the enclosure. They'd sleep with curtains partially open initially, allowing air to circulate while awake bodies generated heat. Only later, once the space was thoroughly warm and sleep had deepened, would someone rise and pull the curtains fully closed. This delayed sealing brought crucial hours of better air quality. Different regions developed different approaches, each calibrated to specific climate challenges. Scandinavian solutions emphasized thicker barriers with more careful ventilation planning. Their winters were more brutal and their margin for error smaller. French approaches often involved more elaborate curtain systems with multiple layers that could be adjusted throughout the night. English methods tended toward moderately heavy curtains with standardized ventilation gaps, a practical middle ground. But none of these were perfect solutions. They were compromises, adjustments, nightly negotiations between competing needs. The medieval bedroom wasn't a solved problem. It was an ongoing experiment that every household conducted simultaneously, each family refining their approach through generations of cold nights and difficult mornings. Some got it right most of the time. Others didn't. The evidence suggests the mortality rate from nighttime cold exposure and poor air quality was significant, though impossible to precisely quantify from surviving records. The air quality problem had another consequence that nobody talks about. It changed how medieval people slept. Not just where or with whom, but the actual structure of sleep itself. Medieval people didn't sleep through the night. They couldn't. And the hour they spent awake at 2 in the morning wasn't a problem to be solved. It was probably what kept them alive. For most of human history, sleep came in 2 distinct phases. First sleep began shortly after darkness fell, lasting roughly 3 to 4 hours. Then came a period of quiet wakefulness, 1 to 3 hours long. Then second sleep carried people through until dawn. This wasn't insomnia. It wasn't a sleep disorder. It was normal, expected, so deeply woven into the culture that the language reflected it without question. Historical documents mention first sleep and second sleep as casually as we might distinguish between breakfast and lunch. Legal depositions specify that events occurred after first sleep but before second. Medical texts prescribe treatments to be taken upon waking from first sleep. Church manuals schedule prayers for the wakeful hours between sleeps, assuming congregants would be naturally awake during these times. The pattern appears across cultures, across centuries, documented so consistently that its universality becomes undeniable. But what did people do during those dark, wakeful hours? Prayer was common. Religious texts from the period include specific prayers designated for nighttime waking. Sex, too, was apparently more common during this interval than at bedtime, when exhaustion typically prevailed. Some people checked on livestock or children. Others added small amounts of fuel to fires that were allowed to smolder overnight, but never fully extinguish. There are even documented accounts of neighbors visiting each other at 1 in the morning, having brief conversations, then returning home for second sleep. The night wasn't dead time to be endured. It had its own rhythm, its own purposes. Here's where it connects to survival. During that wakeful period, people could adjust their arrangements, reposition themselves in the bed to relieve pressure and improve circulation, briefly pull back the curtains, exposing themselves to cold air that felt sharp and clarifying after hours in the enclosed warmth. Check on children or elderly household members to ensure they weren't getting too cold or too hot. Open gaps for ventilation if the air felt heavy. close gaps if cold had crept in too aggressively, then burrow back into the warmth for second sleep, having reset everything. This pattern was likely an adaptation to the suffocation paradox. By waking naturally every few hours, the body could regulate competing needs without conscious decision-making. You didn't have to stay awake worrying about air quality or temperature. Your biology simply brought you to consciousness at intervals, allowing brief adjustments, then returned you to sleep. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Modern sleep research has revealed something startling. When researchers place people in environments without artificial lighting, no electric lights, no screens, no light pollution, this biphasic pattern re-emerges within weeks. People who've spent their entire lives sleeping in single blocks suddenly begin waking naturally after 3 or 4 hours, spending time quietly awake, then returning to sleep. The pattern isn't learned. It's not cultural. It appears to be our default biological rhythm, suppressed by modern lighting conditions. We've trained ourselves out of something fundamental. Electric lights extended our active day deep into natural sleeping hours, compressing our sleep into shorter windows. We convinced ourselves that 8 continuous hours was normal, natural, the way humans were meant to sleep. We pathologized midnight waking, treating it as insomnia requiring pharmaceutical intervention. But medieval people would have found our sleep patterns bizarre, dangerous even, lying unconscious for 8 hours straight, never checking conditions, never adjusting, never allowing the body its natural wakeful interval. Medieval sleep was fundamentally different from modern sleep, not just in duration or quality or comfort, but in its actual structure. The architecture of their nights had evolved to solve problems we no longer face, using biological rhythms we've largely forgotten. They worked with their bodies' natural patterns. We fight against ours. But even with biphasic sleep helping them manage the air quality, there were still the coldest hours. Those last hours before dawn, when body temperature naturally drops, when the air is at its coldest, when the night has sucked every trace of residual warmth from the stones. Those hours required something else entirely. The most dangerous hours weren't the deepest part of night. They came just before dawn, roughly 4 to 6 in the morning, when 2 lethal factors converged. Outside air temperature reached its absolute lowest point, and inside human bodies, core temperature dipped as part of the natural circadian rhythm. This combination killed people. More deaths occurred during these pre-dawn hours than any other part of the night. Infants would simply stop breathing. Elderly people who'd seemed fine at bedtime wouldn't wake. The sick, already weakened, couldn't maintain enough warmth to survive until sunrise. Medieval people recognized this window. They knew dawn was a gauntlet, and not everyone would pass through it. The countermeasures were strategic and specific. The warmest sleeper, usually an adult in prime health, occupied the center position in any group sleeping arrangement. Their body heat radiated in all directions, benefiting everyone around them. More vulnerable people were positioned to receive heat from multiple sources. A child might sleep between 2 adults, or an elderly grandparent flanked by adult children. During deep winter, children were never placed on the outside edges of beds where they'd have cold exposure on one side. That positioning could be fatal. Pregnant women received priority placement and additional covers. Their metabolic needs were higher, their vulnerability greater. In households with servants, the sleeping arrangements often reflected this thermal calculus more than social hierarchy. A healthy young servant might sleep in a more central position than a wealthy but frail master, because keeping everyone alive mattered more than maintaining social distinctions in the dark. Some households developed watch schedules. Adults would take turns waking during the dangerous hours to check on others. Not just family, servants, children, livestock in attached shelters. These weren't formal military watches, just someone rising in the cold dark, moving through the household, ensuring everyone still breathed, adjusting covers, adding a scrap of fuel to dying fires, then returning to their own bed for whatever warmth remained before dawn. Archaeological evidence tells the other side of this story. Cold weather deaths in medieval cemeteries show distinct patterns. Elevated mortality among infants and elderly during winter months. Clusters of deaths in particularly brutal years when survival systems failed. The bones don't lie about who died and approximately when. The patterns suggest people understood the danger, understood what they were fighting against, but couldn't always win. Medieval laws and church records include specific provisions for deaths by cold. Not as rare tragedies, but as regular occurrences requiring administrative process. How to handle property when someone froze. Whether such deaths required investigation. What prayers were appropriate. The documentation treats cold death as commonplace, unfortunate, but ultimately expected in harsh winters. People did freeze to death in their beds, enough that the society built frameworks around it. But the ones who survived, and most did survive, or the population wouldn't have persisted, had systems, rituals, community practices that maximized odds. They positioned bodies strategically. They monitored vulnerable members. They shared heat without hesitation or embarrassment. They understood that individual comfort mattered less than collective survival. In medieval winter, bedtime wasn't a routine. It was a strategic operation. You assessed conditions, positioned people carefully, managed your enclosure's microclimate, and hoped you'd calculated correctly. If you made it to sunrise without freezing or suffocating, you'd won. Then you had to do it all over again the next night, and the next. Month after month until winter finally released its grip. So they survived the nights, barely, strategically, collectively. But survival isn't just about not dying. It's about maintaining function, maintaining sanity. And that required something beyond physical strategies. It required psychological adaptation. Freezing to death was a risk you could calculate against. Going mad from months of relentless cold was almost guaranteed. Medieval people didn't have therapists or antidepressants or any framework for understanding what was happening to their minds. They had stories, prayers, and beer. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Modern psychology recognizes seasonal affective disorder, gives it an acronym, prescribes light therapy and medication. Medieval people just knew that winter made people different. Melancholic, phlegmatic, sometimes violent, sometimes withdrawn. They observed the patterns without understanding the mechanisms, trying to explain why healthy people became sad, why calm people became aggressive, why whole communities seemed to sink into darkness that matched the season. Their medical framework attributed it to humoral imbalance. Cold, they believed, increased phlegm and black bile in the body, causing sadness and lethargy. The theory was scientifically wrong but observationally accurate. They were witnessing real phenomena: vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, Circadian rhythm, disruption from long darkness, social isolation from being trapped indoors, chronic stress from constant cold exposure. They didn't have the vocabulary for these concepts, but they saw the effects clearly enough. Documentary evidence reveals the psychological toll in stark detail. Medieval texts describe winter as a time of increased violence within households. Monastery records show spikes in disciplinary problems during deep winter. Monks fighting, refusing orders, falling into what the chronicles call despair. Legal records document more domestic disputes, more assaults, more cases of what they termed winter madness. The season didn't just make people uncomfortable, it made them unstable. The burden wasn't merely the discomfort, it was the relentlessness. Modern people experiencing seasonal depression can book flights to sunny destinations, take weekend breaks, imagine the eventual relief of spring. Medieval people had no such escapes. No heated car to retreat into. No hot shower to warm frozen limbs and reset frozen minds. No electric lights to push back the darkness. Just cold. Night after night. Week after week. Roughly 5 months of every year. For your entire life. The psychological weight of that infinity was crushing. They developed coping mechanisms because they had to. Community gatherings around whatever fires were permitted became crucial for more than warmth. They were psychological lifelines. People would crowd into whatever space had heat, tolerating smoke and overcrowding because being together made the darkness bearable. Storytelling traditions flourished during winter nights. Not entertainment in our sense, but survival tools. Stories distracted from cold, from darkness, from the grinding sameness of winter existence. They created mental spaces where listeners could escape, however briefly. Religious frameworks gave structure and meaning to suffering. Winter was God's test. Endurance demonstrated faith. Spring would come as surely as Christ rose, not because of meteorology, but because divine order promised it. This wasn't mere superstition. It was psychological architecture that made unbearable suffering bearable by placing it within a larger narrative of meaning. And they drank. Medieval people consumed alcohol in quantities that would horrify modern health professionals. Beer was safer than water, yes. It provided calories that mattered in winter, certainly. But it also provided psychological relief. It dulled the edge of cold. It made dark hours pass more easily. It turned groups of miserable people into groups of temporarily less miserable people. The line between medicinal drinking and problem drinking was invisible because everyone drank constantly. What modern therapy calls distress tolerance, the ability to experience severe discomfort without falling apart, was their default state of existence for months at a time. They couldn't avoid winter, couldn't medicate their way through it, couldn't escape it. They had to develop psychological resilience we can barely imagine. The capacity to wake up knowing you'd be cold all day, go to bed knowing you'd be cold all night, and do it again tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, until the season finally changed. Some succeeded, some didn't. The ones who broke, the ones who became violent or catatonic, or lost themselves in what medieval medicine called melancholia, show up in the records as cautionary tales and administrative problems. The ones who endured simply survive without documentation, their psychological resilience unremarked, because it was expected. But some medieval people found something unexpected in the endless cold nights. a different kind of consciousness, a different way of experiencing time and reality that we've completely lost. When you spend enough time in complete darkness, your brain starts seeing things that aren't there. Medieval people spent half their lives in that darkness. What they saw shaped how they understood reality itself. Complete darkness is nearly impossible to experience in the modern world. Light pollution bleaches out the night. Electric lights glow from every building. Screens illuminate rooms at 3 in the morning. Even in sleep, ambient light seeps through curtains, under doors, from digital clocks and charging indicators. True darkness, the kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face, has become rare enough to be remarkable. Medieval people lived in that darkness roughly 14 to 16 hours per day during deep winter. The sun set around 4 in the afternoon. It didn't rise again until past 8 in the morning. Between those times, darkness was absolute. Firelight and candlelight existed, certainly, but sparingly. Most households couldn't afford to burn candles or maintain fires all night. They conserved light for necessary tasks, then surrendered to darkness for the rest. Our brains behave strangely in extended darkness. Time perception distorts. An hour can feel like minutes or like days. Sensory experiences heighten. Hearing becomes acute. Touch becomes primary. The boundary between waking and sleeping dissolves into something fluid and uncertain. Hypnagogic states, that threshold consciousness between sleep and wakefulness, become more frequent, more vivid, harder to distinguish from regular awareness. Medieval accounts describe this consistently. Chronicles mention dreams that felt more real than waking life. Visions that arrived with complete sensory detail. Not vague impressions, but fully formed experiences with visual, auditory, even tactile components. A sense of timelessness during long winter nights, where hours passed without clear demarcation, where consciousness drifted in ways that made remembering difficult. Religious visions were reported far more frequently in winter than other seasons. Mystics describe their most profound experiences occurring during cold, dark meditation. Saints' lives recount pivotal spiritual encounters happening during winter solitude. This wasn't coincidence or superstition. It was neurology. When the brain is deprived of visual input for extended periods, it compensates by generating its own. The same mechanisms behind sensory deprivation hallucinations were activating nightly in medieval bedrooms in Neur. The visual cortex, starved for input, began creating imagery from memory, expectation, fear, hope. The experiences felt completely real because neurologically they were real. The brain was processing them identically to actual sensory input. Medieval people had no framework to understand this scientifically, so they interpreted these experiences through the only lens available, spiritual and supernatural. The visions had to mean something, had to come from somewhere beyond themselves. Angels delivering messages, demons testing faith, deceased relatives returning with warnings or comfort, prophetic glimpses of futures that might or might not arrive. The accounts are numerous and detailed. A monk seeing his dead abbot standing at the foot of his bed, speaking clearly, then vanishing. A peasant woman encountering a figure she identified as the Virgin Mary, receiving instructions about caring for her sick child. A merchant convinced he'd witnessed angels battling demons above his village during a particularly brutal winter night. These weren't metaphors. To the people experiencing them, They were as real as sunrise. This shaped medieval spirituality profoundly. Winter became associated with the supernatural. Boundaries between the living world and the spirit world seemed thinner during dark months. Divine communication felt more possible, more likely. The season when physical survival was most precarious was also the season when spiritual experiences intensified. Christmas occurring during the darkest part of the year wasn't coincidental. It was strategic, placing hope, celebration, and the promise of divine intervention at the exact moment when psychological darkness reached its nadir. The birth of light during maximum darkness. The theology mapped perfectly onto the psychological reality people experienced. Winter darkness didn't just threaten medieval people. It transformed their consciousness. It gave them access to states of mind we've largely lost. Experiences we can explain neurologically, but can no longer easily replicate. They lived in altered states we now only achieve through intentional effort. Meditation retreats, sensory deprivation tanks, carefully controlled environments. But not everyone could afford the luxury of visions and mystical experiences. For most medieval people, winter nights weren't about transcendence. They were about survival at its most basic, and that meant food. Your body is a furnace that runs on food. Medieval people understood that survival meant feeding the furnace, even when the fuel stores were running empty, even when choosing who ate meant choosing who lived. Here's the calculation most people never consider. Your body burns significantly more calories when exposed to cold, fighting constantly to maintain core temperature. Medieval people living in minimally heated environments during deep winter could require 3,500 to 5,000 calories per day, nearly double what modern sedentary adults need. That's not for heavy labor. That's just for existing in the cold, for keeping your internal furnace burning hot enough to prevent hypothermia while you sleep. Winter was also when food was scarcest. Harvest had ended months ago. Spring planting remained months away. Preservation techniques were limited. Salting, smoking, drying, storing in cool cellars. But food depleted steadily. Every day meant less in storage. Every meal reduced what remained for tomorrow. And bodies were demanding more fuel precisely when less was available. The vicious cycle was inescapable. You need more calories to stay warm. But you have access to fewer calories. So your body becomes less capable of generating warmth, which means you need even more calories to compensate. The deficit compounds. People grew weaker as winter progressed, their bodies consuming themselves trying to maintain temperature. Medieval households developed strategic eating schedules around this reality. The heaviest meal came before bed, loading the body with fuel for the long cold night ahead. Digestion itself generates heat. A full stomach provided both raw calories and the thermal byproduct of metabolizing them. Going to bed hungry meant waking up cold if you woke up at all. Specific foods dominated winter diets for thermal reasons. Fatty meats when available. Fat contains more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrates. Dense breads made from whatever grains remained in storage. Pottages thick with beans and grains, sometimes simmered for days. Every family member eating from the same pot that sat near the fire. These weren't gourmet choices. They were survival calculations. Alcohol played a crucial role beyond psychological comfort. A mug of strong medieval ale could provide 200 to 300 calories while creating a temporary sensation of warmth. The warmth was partly illusion. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, bringing warm blood to the skin surface, which actually increases heat loss. But the calories were real, and the psychological effect of feeling warmer, even briefly, mattered when cold was relentless. Class differences became stark around food access. Wealthy households could afford to eat heavily throughout winter. Their stores were deeper, their purchasing power greater, their access to preserved delicacies reliable. But common people faced agonizing choices. Feed everyone barely enough, keeping all alive but all weak. Or feed some adequately, prioritizing working adults, pregnant women, healthy children, while others received less. Medieval winter charity wasn't sentimentality. It was survival strategy, redistributing calories from those who had surplus to those who had deficit prevented mass death. Churches organized food distribution. Wealthy households provided meals to poor neighbors. Communities shared resources because dead neighbors meant fewer workers for spring planting, fewer defenders if trouble came, fewer people to maintain the social fabric everyone depended on. Skeletal remains tell this story in bone. Archaeologists find seasonal weight fluctuations in medieval skeletons, growth arrest lines showing periods when nutrition was inadequate. Nutritional stress markers appear predominantly in individuals who died during winter. The bones remember hunger. The psychological impact of chronic hunger, layered over chronic cold, created suffering modern people struggle to comprehend. Not the acute hunger of missing one meal, but months of never feeling fully fed, never feeling truly warm. Your body slowly consuming itself while demanding more fuel you cannot provide. The mental fog, the irritability, the despair, the calculations about who eats how much. Food kept the internal furnace burning. But there were external strategies too. Ways medieval people modified their environment, their bodies, and their behaviors to tip the scales toward survival. A stone heated by your afternoon fire could save your life that night. Medieval people turned physics into survival equipment, with nothing more than rocks from the river and wool from their sheep. Before electric heating pads, before hot water bottles, before any modern convenience, medieval people discovered something elegant. Certain materials, when heated, remember that heat for hours. Stone especially. Dense, heavy stone could absorb tremendous thermal energy and release it slowly, predictably, usefully through the coldest hours of night. The bed-warming ritual began hours before sleep. Large river stones, fist-sized or bigger, would be positioned near the hearth, where daily cooking happened. Not in the fire itself, which could crack them, but close enough to absorb heat steadily. 3, 4, 5 hours of slow heating. The stones would become almost too hot to touch, storing energy that had nowhere to go until someone gave it purpose. As curfew approached and the household prepared for bed, someone would retrieve these stones using tongs or heavy cloth. Each stone would be wrapped carefully in multiple layers of wool or linen. The wrapping was crucial. Too little, and you'd burn yourself or scorch your bedding. Too much, and you'd insulate away the heat you needed. Medieval people learned the balance through generations of trial and painful error. These wrapped stones would be placed strategically in the bed, usually at the foot, where cold hit hardest and circulation struggled most. Sometimes between layers of blankets rather than directly against the body. Occasionally inside specially sewn woolen pouches, designed specifically for this purpose, with ties to secure them and extra padding for safety. The physics made it work beautifully. Stone has high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat energy slowly, but releases it slowly too. A properly heated river stone could provide noticeable warmth for 4 to 6 hours, enough to get through first sleep entirely. Enough to make the bed's microclimate survivable during the coldest stretches. By the time the stone cooled completely, dawn was approaching and the worst danger had passed. Wealthy households developed more sophisticated versions. Metal warming pans, long-handled covered pans, usually brass or copper, filled with hot coals from the fire. Servants would run these between sheets just before bedtime, warming the fabric directly, chasing cold from every corner of the bed. The pans themselves were valuable enough to appear in household inventories, listed alongside other precious items, sometimes passed down through generations. Archaeological evidence confirms how widespread this practice was. Warming pans appear in excavations across medieval Europe. Medieval household management texts include detailed instructions for their proper use. How hot the coals should be, how long to warm the bed, how to avoid scorching expensive linens. The attention given to these details suggests how seriously people took the technology. Even the poorest peasant could participate. River stones cost nothing. Fire was already burning for cooking. Wool scraps could wrap the stones adequately. This democratization of survival technology meant the practice was truly universal. Everyone, regardless of wealth, could make their beds slightly less lethal. Regional variations emerged based on available materials and local climate severity. Some areas preferred heated bricks, which were more uniform in size and shape, easier to wrap and position. Others used ceramic containers filled with hot water, the medieval ancestor of the rubber hot water bottle. Just as effective, but far more breakable. Scandinavian cultures, facing the most brutal winters, sometimes heated large flat stones to sleep on top of, with appropriate layers of insulation between stone and body. The heat radiating upward could warm multiple people simultaneously. This wasn't merely about comfort, though comfort mattered. Cold feet alone can prevent sleep entirely. The body prioritizes core temperature over extremities, restricting blood flow to hands and feet when cold. This creates a vicious cycle. Cold feet signal the brain that the environment is dangerous, preventing deep sleep, which means less rest, which means less resilience the next day. Severe cold in extremities can cause circulation damage over time, leading to chilblains, frostbite, or worse. By solving the cold feet problem, warming stones dramatically improved both sleep quality and survival odds. People could rest more deeply. Children slept through the night instead of waking repeatedly from cold. The sick and elderly maintained better circulation. It was simple physics transformed into life-saving technology. Warming stones solved the cold bed problem, but they couldn't heat an entire room or make stone walls less brutal. For that, medieval people needed to hack the architecture itself. Those tapestries in medieval paintings, they're not showing off wealth, they're showing off survival equipment. Remove them, and the people in that room would be 15 degrees colder. We look at surviving medieval tapestries in museums and see art, elaborate scenes of hunts, biblical stories, courtly life woven in expensive dyes. We see them as decoration, as the status symbols, as evidence of wealth and refined taste. Medieval people saw them as the difference between surviving winter and freezing in a stone box. Stone walls are brutal thermal conductors. They absorb cold from outside air and radiate it inward relentlessly. Touch a stone wall on a winter night and your hand recoils. The stone is actively pulling heat from your body. A room with bare stone walls is nearly uninhabitable in deep winter, no matter how large the fire. The walls steal heat faster than you can generate it. Heavy wool tapestries hanging on those walls created something crucial: an air gap. Several inches of dead airspace between the fabric and the stone. That gap was the key to everything. Air, when it's trapped and motionless, is an excellent insulator. Moving air steals heat through convection. Still air preserves it. The physics worked elegantly. The tapestry itself provided one layer of insulation, wool especially, with its naturally crimped fibers full of microscopic air pockets. But the air gap behind the tapestry was even more important. Cold radiating from the stone dissipated into that dead space rather than entering the room directly. The fabric blocked drafts that would otherwise create convection currents. Together, the combination could reduce heat loss through walls by 30 to 40%. That's not marginal improvement. That's the difference between habitable and uninhabitable. Some wealthy households understood this well enough to hang multiple layers of fabric silt on exterior walls during winter. 2 or 3 tapestries deep, creating multiple air pockets, compounding the insulating effect. It looked like excessive decoration. It was sophisticated environmental engineering. Household accounts from noble estates show careful seasonal management of textiles. Tapestries were brought out of storage in autumn, hung with ceremony as winter approached. They remained through the cold months. Then in spring, they'd be taken down, cleaned, and stored away. This wasn't about protecting the tapestries from summer moths, though that mattered too. It was about not wasting insulation when you didn't need it. Summer brought different challenges. You wanted air circulation then, not dead air spaces. Class differences appeared in materials, not understanding. Wealthy people commissioned elaborate wool tapestries featuring complex scenes and expensive dyes. But even the poorest households hung what they had. Animal skins, fur side toward the room, stretched across sections of wall. Rough wool blankets too worn for beds. Stuffed fabric sacks full of straw, hung like primitive quilts. The materials differed, but the principle remained identical. Create dead airspace, block convection, preserve heat. Medieval people even practiced what we'd now call solar wall strategy. They understood that south-facing walls received winter sun and could absorb thermal energy during daylight. Those walls were sometimes left more exposed or covered with lighter fabrics to capture whatever warmth was available. North and west walls, prevailing wind directions that brought the coldest air, received the heaviest covering, the most layers, the most careful attention. This wasn't knowledge they read in textbooks. It was intuitive environmental engineering developed through generations of cold winters and careful observation. They manipulated their spaces with available tools, making stone architecture survivable in climates it was never designed for. Every hanging fabric served multiple purposes simultaneously. Perhaps beauty, certainly status signaling, but fundamentally survival. Modern restoration of medieval spaces often hangs replica tapestries for historical accuracy without understanding their function. The rooms look period appropriate, but remain uncomfortably cold because the tapestries are hung purely decoratively, often with space behind them for preservation rather than insulation. Medieval people would have considered this insane. Every square foot of fabric represented investment and effort. None of it was wasted on pure decoration. But the most important insulation wasn't on the walls or in the bed. It was on their bodies. What medieval people wore to sleep is nothing like what we wear. And there was a very specific reason for every single layer. Medieval people wore what essentially amounted to sleeping bags made of layered wool and linen. Uncomfortable? Probably. Alive in the morning? Definitely. We have this image of medieval people climbing into bed naked, or nearly so, perhaps wearing minimal garments, trusting their blankets alone to provide warmth. It's a completely modern fantasy. Sleeping naked became fashionable only after central heating made it survivable. Medieval people would have considered it suicidal. They wore sleeping armor. Not metal, but carefully engineered layers of fabric designed to maximize heat retention while managing the moisture their bodies produce through the night. Every layer had a purpose. Every piece of the system mattered. The base layer was always linen, a shift or chemise worn directly against skin. Modern people might find this counterintuitive. Wool seems warmer, so why not wear wool against your body? Because linen wicks moisture away from skin. Your body sweats even in cold, especially when wrapped in layers. That moisture needs somewhere to go. If it stays against your skin, evaporative cooling makes you feel dramatically colder. Dampness amplifies cold in ways that can quickly become dangerous. Linen pulled that moisture away, keeping skin relatively dry. Over the linen came wool, a sleeping gown or nightshirt, sometimes extending to the ankles, sometimes shorter. Wool is miraculous material for cold climates. It insulates even when damp. Its crimped fibers trap air, creating thousands of tiny insulating pockets. It retains warmth even as you move during sleep. The wool layer was the primary thermal barrier, the main defense against cold. On particularly brutal nights, additional layers appeared. Bed jackets, short wool coats designed specifically for sleeping. Wool balls worn over the nightshirt. Sometimes even a second nightgown. Medieval people understood that multiple thinner layers insulated better than one thick layer because of the air trapped between them. Head coverings were nearly universal. Nightcaps, coifs, sometimes simple cloth wrapped around the head. Significant heat loss occurs through the scalp. Your brain receives disproportionate blood flow regardless of temperature, and that warm blood radiates heat away if your head is exposed. Medieval people didn't understand the physiological mechanisms, but they observed the effect clearly. Covered head equals warmer body. The correlation was obvious enough that sleeping without head covering was considered foolish. Feet received similar attention. Wool slippers, sometimes fur-lined for the wealthy, wool socks, or even leg wrappings for those who couldn't afford specialized footwear. Cold feet, as mentioned earlier, could prevent sleep entirely and cause circulation damage. Keeping them insulated was crucial. This wasn't random layering. It was an engineered system. The order mattered critically. Linen against skin for moisture management. Wool over linen for insulation. Additional layers available to add or remove during the wakeful periods between first and second sleep. Medieval people could adjust their personal insulation through the night as conditions changed. adding layers if cold increased, removing layers if they'd built up too much heat. Archaeological evidence confirms these practices. Preserved garments from medieval contexts show elaborate sleeping attire. Artistic depictions in manuscript illuminations frequently show people in bed wearing nightcaps and visible nightclothes. The consistency across sources suggests this was universal practice, not just wealthy affectation. We associate nightgowns and pajamas with comfort, relaxation, luxury. Their medieval ancestors were about something else entirely. Survival equipment you wore continuously because your life depended on it. They weren't comfortable in the way we use that word. They were functional. They kept you alive. Regional variations reflected local climate severity. Scandinavian peoples slept in even more elaborate layered clothing, sometimes 3 or 4 layers plus outer wraps. Mediterranean regions used lighter fabrics but followed the same layering principle. The specific materials changed, but the understanding remained consistent. Bare skin loses heat catastrophically, layers preserve it. Here's something that shocks modern sensibilities. People rarely fully undressed in winter. The base layers, that linen shift, those wool undergarments, might stay on for days or weeks. Only removed for occasional bathing, which was less frequent in winter anyway. Modern hygiene standards make this seem appalling. Medieval survival calculus made it logical. The body's warmth was too precious to let escape during the complex process of changing clothes. So they had the bed technology, the room modifications, the clothing. But all of this assumed you were indoors, in a proper castle or home. What about the people who weren't? Because winter didn't stop travel, warfare, or work. It just made all of it deadly. In medieval winter, a full day's travel could put you in the middle of nowhere when night fell. Your choices were keep walking and die of exhaustion or stop and die of cold. Some people found a third option. You're a merchant traveling between towns. Maybe a pilgrim heading toward a shrine. A soldier moving with your unit. A messenger carrying urgent documents. Winter hasn't stopped your journey because winter couldn't stop everything. Trade had to continue, messages had to be delivered, wars didn't pause for snow. But you've miscalculated. The road was harder than expected. Progress slower. Night is falling and you're still hours from the next village or inn. The temperature is dropping fast. This is the moment where medieval travel became medieval survival. Forced outdoor winter sleeping was common enough that specific techniques evolved and spread through practical necessity. Travelers shared knowledge because everyone eventually faced this situation. The strategies appear consistently across different accounts from different regions, suggesting they worked well enough to be worth repeating. First priority: find a natural windbreak. Wind is more dangerous than cold temperature alone. Wind strips away the warm air layer your body generates, forcing continuous heat production that depletes your energy catastrophically. Rocky outcroppings that blocked prevailing winds. Dense clusters of evergreen trees whose branches created overhead cover. Even snowbanks, counterintuitively, you could dig into deep snow and burrow inside. Snow is an excellent insulator when properly used. The air trapped in its structure prevents heat transfer. People have survived nights inside snow caves that would have killed them in the open air a few feet away. Horses became multi-purpose survival equipment. Their large bodies blocked wind. Their metabolism generated significant heat. Travelers would position themselves on the leeward side of their horses, using the animals as living windbreaks. Some accounts describe people sleeping pressed against their horse's side and sharing body heat. The horse benefited too. Human presence provided predator deterrence and companionship that kept the animal calmer. Fire was the other essential, but maintaining it required constant effort. A small fire through winter night needed continuous tending. Fuel had to be added regularly. The fire needed protection from wind and moisture. Someone had to stay awake. Groups traveling together developed rotating watch schedules, not primarily for security, though that mattered, but for fire maintenance. Sleep in shifts, tend the fire in shifts, survive collectively. The documentary evidence is extensive once you look for it. Pilgrim accounts describe winter night stops with matter-of-fact detail that suggests how routine this danger was. A merchant's journal from the 14th century mentions sleeping in a snow hollow with his horse, waking every hour to check the animal and restore circulation to his own feet. Military campaign records describe soldiers bedding down in forest clearings, 4 men to a fire, rotating watch through the night. These weren't dramatic survival stories, they were Tuesday. Winter travel was dangerous enough that most people simply avoided it. Travel from December through February dropped dramatically unless circumstances were urgent. Those who did travel moved in groups whenever possible. Mutual survival support. If one person's fire went out, another's might still burn. If someone showed signs of hypothermia, companions could intervene. Solo winter travel was nearly suicidal. Innovations evolved to improve odds. Traveling bedrolls that were essentially portable insulation systems, wool blankets sewn together in sleeping bag configurations, sometimes with leather outer layers for water resistance, oiled cloth wrappings that shed snow and rain while trapping heat. Layered clothing designed to be lived in continuously for days or weeks. You didn't undress at night because you had no shelter warm enough to make undressing survivable. Medieval travelers were wilderness survival experts by necessity, skills we now train for as specialized outdoor recreation, fire building, shelter construction, hypothermia recognition, cold weather clothing systems were basic requirements for anyone who needed to travel. Children learned these skills because someday they'd need them. The difference between knowing and not knowing was often the difference between living and dying. Travelers knew they were gambling with their lives, but at least they chose to be out there. Some people had no choice. They were born into situations where shelter was luxury, not certainty. Wealthy medieval people fought against the cold with technology, tactics, and resources. Poor medieval people fought against the cold with nothing but other warm bodies and hope. Often, hope lost. Everything discussed so far, elaborate bed curtains, multiple wool blankets, warming stones carefully positioned, tapestries on walls, layered sleeping garments, was available primarily to those with means. The wealthy and emerging middle class had options. They had choices. The vast majority of medieval people had neither. Most medieval Europeans were peasants living in conditions that made survival precarious every single winter. A typical peasant dwelling was a single room, perhaps 200 to 400 square feet total. The floor was packed earth or rough wooden planks. The roof was thatched, water-resistant when properly maintained, but constantly developing leaks, and completely permeable to heat. Warmth rose and escaped into the winter night. The walls were wattle and daub, woven branches packed with mud and straw, effective when new but developing cracks and gaps as they aged. Drafts penetrated everywhere. Heat came from a central hearth, not a proper fireplace with a chimney, but an open fire burning on a stone or earthen pad in the middle of the room. Smoke rose and exited through the thatch or a hole in the roof, filling the space with haze before finding its way out. The inefficiency was staggering. Most heat went straight up and away. What remained barely warmed the small room. Often humans shared this space with livestock, a cow or two, some goats, chickens. Not for companionship, but for survival. Animal bodies generated significant heat. A cow produces as much warmth as 10 or 12 humans. In the coldest months, having livestock indoors could mean the difference between freezing and not. The smell was overwhelming, the noise constant, the hygiene terrible. But the warmth was real. Sleeping arrangements were brutally simple. Straw pallets or mattresses laid directly on the floor. No bed frames, no curtains, no elaborate systems. Entire families sleeping together. Parents, children, sometimes extended family, all sharing whatever coverings they possessed. Often just 1 or 2 wool blankets for 6 or 8 people. Sometimes animal skins. Sometimes just more straw piled on top of the as makeshift insulation. They slept in their daytime clothes, not because they preferred it, but because they owned so little clothing that changing was meaningless, and the clothes themselves provided crucial insulation. Layers worn until they fell apart, then patched and worn longer. Peasant winter survival was about minimizing disaster, not achieving anything resembling comfort. The goal was simply to not die. Deaths from cold were common enough that medieval records don't always specify the cause. Someone dying in winter was expected, unremarkable, just part of the seasonal mortality everyone anticipated. The strategies that existed were desperate. Communal sleeping even more densely packed than wealthy households. 6 people generating 600 watts of heat pressed together without privacy or space. Small fires kept burning longer than regulations allowed, risking fines from the Lord but preventing freezing. Extensive use of straw and hay, cheap, locally available, and surprisingly effective insulation when piled thickly enough. You could bury yourself in hay and survive a night that would kill you exposed. Medieval winter was suffering for nearly everyone. But for the wealthy, it was discomfort with survival tools and backup plans. For the poor, it was potentially lethal every single night. The technology existed to make winter survivable. It just wasn't distributed to most of the people who needed it. Records show this in stark numbers. Winter mortality spiked among peasant populations. Children and elderly died disproportionately. Harsh winters meant not just difficult seasons, but demographic collapse in vulnerable communities. Spring arrived to find villages with fewer people than autumn left them. The cold took its share. But there was one group even more vulnerable than peasants, one category of people for whom winter nights were almost guaranteed death sentences: the homeless, the banished, and the outcasts. Medieval society had elaborate survival systems, but only if you were part of society. If you weren't, winter was simply death on a timer. Some people beat the clock, most didn't. Every medieval community had them. People without permanent shelter, vagrants moving between towns seeking work or charity, beggars who'd lost everything to debt, disaster, or disease. Outlaws banished from communities, legally forbidden from receiving aid, religious ascetics who'd chosen homelessness as spiritual practice, displaced populations fleeing warfare or famine, the unlucky, the abandoned, the rejected. Medieval winter was a mortality filter for these marginalized people. The survival technologies we've discussed, beds, blankets, fires, walls, assumed you had a structure to put them in, resources to acquire them, community to share them with. Without those foundations, winter became an execution you could see coming for months, but couldn't escape. Some strategies existed. Churches and monasteries provided emergency shelter during the coldest nights, though often only when temperatures reached truly lethal levels. Canon law required Christian charity, and some institutions took this seriously. Documented accounts describe beggars being admitted to monastery warming rooms when snow fell heavily, or when their survival outside was clearly impossible. But this relief was sporadic, dependent on local interpretation of duty, and often came with obligations, labor, prayer, or departure once immediate danger passed. Makeshift shelters appeared wherever marginalized people could construct them. Forests offered some protection, dense trees blocking wind, fallen logs creating partial walls, leaf litter providing insulation. Abandoned buildings in depopulated areas became informal refuges. Caves and rock shelters housed those lucky enough to find them. These weren't comfortable. They were barely adequate. But barely adequate was infinitely better than completely exposed. Vagrant communities formed out of necessity. Groups pooling whatever resources existed, sharing body heat, maintaining communal fires, watching for each other. Medieval criminal records and poor law documentation mention these informal camps, usually with hostility. Authorities feared vagrant groups as potential criminal organizations or disease vectors. But for the people involved, community was survival infrastructure. Specific techniques emerged from desperation. Documented beggars wore multiple layers of rags, creating insulation through air pockets between fabric layers. The principle was identical to wealthy people's layered clothing, just executed with scraps instead of tailored garments. Animal proximity became crucial. Sleeping near livestock in barns when farmers didn't chase you out, or even with stray dogs, sharing whatever heat their bodies provided. The grimmest documented practice comes from particularly brutal winters. Groups of vagrants sleeping together for warmth would sometimes wake to find that not everyone had survived the night. Rather than abandon these locations, the living would continue using them, positioning themselves between or near those who'd frozen, using corpses as windbreaks. The historical documentation exists, recorded by shocked observers, but it makes a certain terrible logic. The dead no longer needed protection from wind. The living desperately did. Religious institutions, guilds, and wealthier households provided occasional charity, extra food distributed during religious festivals, clothing given away seasonally, in emergency shelter when circumstances became dire enough to motivate action. These interventions saved some lives, but the system was profoundly inadequate to the scale of need. For every person saved by charity, several died without assistance. Medieval winter killed efficiently and continuously at the margins. People froze in alleyways, in forests, in abandoned buildings, in places where their bodies wouldn't be discovered until spring thaw. Many died anonymously, their deaths unrecorded, except perhaps in church burial registers as unnamed paupers. Society's survival mechanisms were communal. Those without community had terrible odds. We can't know how many died. The records don't capture people who had no one to record them. But the survival strategies documented suggest the scale was significant enough that techniques evolved, were shared, were remembered. You don't develop and transmit survival knowledge unless the threat is common and the need urgent. But even those who survived, the ones with shelter and resources, faced another challenge that modern people rarely consider. What winter did to their bodies over years and decades of repeated exposure. Your bones record every winter you survive. Medieval skeletons are textbooks written in calcium, telling stories about cold that their owners never wrote down. Archaeology reveals what documents cannot. Written records describe winters, mention deaths, discuss survival strategies. But bones carry evidence of lived experience, physical proof of what chronic cold exposure does to human bodies over years and decades. Medieval skeletons tell consistent stories across Europe, patterns repeated in cemetery after cemetery, revealing truths their owners never consciously articulated. The evidence begins with bone density. Medieval European skeletons show increased density in extremities, hands, feet, fingers, toes. This isn't random variation, it's physiological adaptation to constant cold stress. The body responds to repeated exposure by reinforcing the structures most vulnerable to damage, building stronger bones where cold hits hardest. Modern populations don't show this pattern to the same degree. Our extremities haven't needed the same reinforcement. Frostbite leaves permanent marks. Bones that have experienced cold injury show characteristic changes. Abnormal new bone growth, remodeling patterns, texture alterations visible to trained observers. Medieval finger and toe bones frequently display these markers, suggesting repeated cold injury throughout life, not necessarily severe enough to require amputation, but significant enough to damage tissue and trigger bone response. These weren't isolated incidents. They were recurring seasonal injuries, accepted as normal. Joint pathologies tell darker stories. Arthritis in medieval skeletons develops earlier and more severely than modern populations, particularly concentrated in hands and feet. Cold exacerbates joint problems. Constant exposure accelerates deterioration. Medieval people were using damaged joints for hard physical labor, while those joints were simultaneously being stressed by temperature. The combination created widespread chronic pain that shows up centuries later in bone changes archaeologists can measure and document. Respiratory issues appear in skeletal structures too. Rib bones and sinus cavities show specific stress patterns consistent with breathing cold air and living in smoky, poorly ventilated environments. The combination damaged respiratory systems systematically. Chronic inflammation, repeated infections, scarring, all leaving traces in bone. Medieval people weren't just cold. They were breathing air that injured them continuously, winter after winter, their bodies fighting constant low-level respiratory assault. Comparative studies reveal these patterns' specificity. Researchers analyzing medieval skeletons from different climate zones find distinct differences. European populations from cold regions show the stress markers described above. Middle Eastern populations from the same time period don't. The skeletal differences aren't ethnic or genetic, they're environmental. Cold left its signature in European bones, while warmer climates produced different baseline health indicators. Medieval bodies were fundamentally different from modern bodies. Shorter on average, partially from nutritional stress certainly, but cold stress also stunts growth during crucial developmental years. Children growing up cold don't reach their full potential height. Their bones tell stories of winters that stole inches from their adult stature. Muscle attachment points on bones reveal different development patterns too. Strong upper bodies from constant physical labor, yes, but also from shivering and tension. Cold creates involuntary muscle contractions. Your body tries to generate heat through movement. Over years, this builds specific musculature patterns visible in skeletal structure. Medieval people were physically strong in ways that reflected their environmental challenges, not just their work demands. Chronic cold exposure isn't just uncomfortable in the moment. It's physiologically damaging across lifetimes. Every winter survived, extracted a price paid in bone density changes, joint deterioration, respiratory damage, growth disruption. Medieval skeletons are records of that accumulated cost, physical testaments to decades of survival. Specific case studies make this personal. One medieval woman's skeleton, excavated from an English cemetery, showed evidence of severe childhood frostbite in both feet. The bones had healed, remodeled, adapted. She survived what killed other children, grew to adulthood, lived decades more. Her skeleton became testament to resilience, to the human capacity to endure and recover from injury that should have been fatal. The bones remembered what no document recorded. A girl who nearly froze, survived, and kept surviving winter after winter. Thousands of skeletons tell similar stories, each one a textbook. Each one evidence that medieval winter survival wasn't abstract historical fact, but lived physical reality that changed bodies permanently. But bones only tell us about physical damage. They can't tell us about something equally important. What chronic cold did to medieval life expectancy and causes of death. Medieval people didn't die of old age. They died of surviving too many winters. Each one you survived damaged your body enough that the next one became more dangerous. Winter wasn't just a season. It was a countdown. Medieval mortality records, church burial registers, and legal documents reveal sobering patterns when examined for seasonal variation. Winter killed dramatically more people than summer. In documented years from various European regions, January and February death rates spiked 20 to 30% above summer baseline mortality. Some particularly brutal winters showed even starker increases. These weren't anomalies. They were normal patterns, expected and repeated. Direct cold exposure, actually freezing to death, killed some people, but far more died from heat-related illness. Cold weakens immune systems systematically. Your body diverts resources to heat generation, leaving less capacity for fighting infection. Respiratory infections that might resolve in summer became life-threatening in winter. A cough became bronchitis. Bronchitis became pneumonia. Pneumonia became death. Medieval medicine had no effective pneumonia treatments, no antibiotics, no oxygen therapy, no ICU care. Pneumonia was often a death sentence, survivable only through luck and robust constitution. Winter turned ordinary respiratory infections into mass killers. The cold didn't just make people uncomfortable, It created conditions where common pathogens became lethal. Cold exacerbated everything else too. Arthritis that was manageable in summer became debilitating in winter. People who could work and function during warm months became immobilized by joint pain when temperatures dropped, unable to care for themselves or contribute to household survival. Heart conditions worsened. Cold stress increases cardiovascular demands. Medieval people didn't understand the mechanism, but they observed that certain people died suddenly during cold snaps. What we now recognize as cold-induced heart attacks were common enough to be unremarkable. Injuries followed different trajectories in winter. A cut that would heal normally in summer might become infected in winter when the body's resources were depleted by constant cold stress. Recovery from illness or injury took longer, if it happened at all. Winter turned manageable health problems into fatal ones. Age patterns reveal vulnerability clearly. Infants and young children were catastrophically vulnerable. Medieval infant mortality was already horrific by modern standards. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. Winter made it worse. Tiny bodies couldn't generate sufficient heat. Immune systems couldn't fight winter infections. Cold killed babies systematically. Elderly people often died in the first severe cold snap. Records show concentrated mortality among older adults in early winter, suggesting many couldn't survive even one brutal night after months of relative health. Their bodies, already worn by decades of accumulated damage, had no reserves left when cold stress arrived. Prime-age adults survived more reliably, but at cost. Each winter extracted its toll in health deterioration. Injury, illness survived, but not recovered from fully. By their 30s and 40s, people showed cumulative damage from decades of winter survival. Life expectancy calculations often cite medieval averages in the low 30s to low 40s, varying by region and social class. But this masks important reality. High infant mortality dramatically lowers averages. If you survived childhood, already a significant filter, you could potentially reach your 50s or 60s. But winter remained a repeated test. Every winter you survived decreased the statistical odds you'd survive the next one as cumulative physiological damage accumulated. Medieval people understood this intuitively. Older adults would arrange affairs in autumn, understanding they might not see spring here. The wheel season occurred in autumn and early winter for reason. Not morbid pessimism, but realistic assessment. Winter was dangerous, and you knew your body's capacity better than anyone. But understanding the death toll is only half the picture. We need to understand what winter survival did to the living, how it shaped culture, religion, and the entire structure of medieval society. Medieval culture wasn't just shaped by war, religion, or politics. It was shaped by the existential terror of winter. Everything from holiday timing to architectural styles to social obligations formed around one question: how do we not die when it gets cold? Winter wasn't merely a practical challenge that people addressed and moved on from. It was a cultural organizing force that structured society in ways we still live with, but no longer recognize. The fingerprints of winter survival are everywhere in medieval culture, once you learn to see them. Consider the church calendar. Christmas falls during the darkest, coldest part of winter, not coincidentally. The major winter feasts, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, were strategically positioned to provide psychological and social relief during months when isolation could be deadly. These weren't just religious observances, they were survival mechanisms disguised as spirituality. They gave communities reasons to gather, share resources, break the psychological monotony of dark months. They maintained social bonds precisely when those bonds meant the difference between collective survival and individual death. Christian charity evolved in direct response to winter mortality. Feeding the poor was framed as spiritual virtue, certainly, but it functioned as community survival strategy. Let your poor neighbors die in winter, and there would be no laborers for spring planting. No workers to maintain roads. No bodies to defend the village if raiders came. Charity kept the social organism alive through its most vulnerable season. Medieval people understood this, even if they articulated it through religious language. Feudal obligations reflect the same logic. Lords weren't required to provide winter support to their peasants purely from benevolence. Dead peasants couldn't work the land, couldn't pay rents, couldn't provide the labor that sustained the entire social hierarchy. Winter support was pragmatic investment in maintaining a functional workforce through the mortality season. The social contract included survival infrastructure because without it, the system would collapse each spring. Winter shaped law and community organization fundamentally. Fire curfew laws weren't arbitrary restrictions. They prevented house fires that could destroy entire communities when rebuilding was impossible. Communal sleeping arrangements being socially acceptable reflected necessity overriding privacy concerns. Legal expectations of housing strangers during deadly cold embedded survival obligations into social fabric. Building codes evolved to maximize collective survival, shared walls, clustered housing, architectural features that reduced heat loss. Cultural attitudes in medieval literature and art consistently associated winter with death, hardship, testing, divine judgment. Winter wasn't backdrop, it was antagonist. Stories set in winter used cold as threat equal to any human enemy. Religious texts framed winter survival as moral test. Those who endured demonstrated virtue. Those who didn't had failed somehow, either practically or spiritually. Spring festivals celebrated more than seasonal renewal. They celebrated survival. Easter's significance operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Yes, resurrection theology, but also emerging alive from winter's grip. The joy wasn't abstract. It was relief. You'd made it through another mortality season. Your community had survived with enough people remaining to function. The religious meaning and the survival meaning were inseparable. Linguistic evidence preserves these memories. English phrases like survive the winter or make it through winter aren't metaphorical. They're literal historical memories embedded in language. When we use these phrases now to describe difficult periods, we're unconsciously echoing generations who meant it completely literally. Winter was the thing you survived or didn't. This shaped long-term cultural memory in ways that persist generations after central heating eliminated the actual threat. European cultures maintain deep winter anxiety that seems disproportionate to modern winter experience. Seasonal affective disorder, holiday stress, winter depression, these have biological components certainly, but also cultural ones. Centuries of winter survival created cultural trauma that echoes through descendant populations even when the material conditions have completely changed. Medieval people built their entire cultural operating system around winter survival. Religion, law, architecture, social obligations, art, language, everything bore the mark of needing to survive cold. We inherited that cultural system. We still live inside structures designed for problems we no longer face. Christmas in December, charitable obligations in winter, cultural anxiety when days get short. So winter shaped everything about medieval life and culture. But was medieval Europe unique? Or did people in other cold climates discover the same solutions? Or different ones? While medieval Europeans were huddling in stone castles, trying not to freeze, Norse peoples were conducting ocean voyages in winter darkness. They didn't survive the cold better because they were tougher. They did it because they built different. Scandinavian winters made English winters look moderate. 6 to 7 months of serious cold rather than 3 or 4. Extreme latitude meant daylight nearly vanished for weeks during deep winter. Temperatures regularly dropped lower than anything southern England experienced. Yet Norse peoples didn't just survive these conditions. They thrived building trade networks, conducting raids, maintaining complex societies through weather that would have paralyzed medieval European civilization. Their success began with architecture. Norse longhouses were fundamentally different from European stone structures. Central hearths with sophisticated smoke management systems that channeled heat through the building before venting outside. The construction itself provided superior insulation. Turf and thick timber rather than stone. Turf is remarkably effective insulation when layered properly. Timber, though it seems less substantial than stone, actually retains and radiates heat better. Norse buildings were designed around thermal efficiency from the foundation up. Sleeping arrangements reflected understanding of physics. Sleeping benches built along walls at elevated positions, typically 3 feet off the ground. This wasn't about status or comfort. It was about heat dynamics. Heat rises, floor level is coldest. By sleeping elevated, Norse people positioned themselves in the warmest available air layer. The benches often had backs and partial canopies, creating semi-enclosed sleeping spaces that trapped body heat while remaining part of the larger communal hall. Bedding technology was sophisticated. Thick reindeer or bear pelts rather than sheep wool. These northern animal furs have different thermal properties. Denser, oilier, superior insulation in extreme cold. Down-filled sleeping sacks that functioned like modern sleeping bags, enclosing the sleeper completely. Archaeological evidence shows these were carefully constructed with inner and outer layers, down trapped between them, openings that could be adjusted to balance warmth retention against air circulation. The communal sleeping hall itself was crucial technology. Rather than dividing households into multiple small cold rooms, Norse longhouses kept everyone together in one large space. Entire extended families, household members, sometimes even livestock in attached sections, all their body heat contributing to a single shared microclimate. The larger the group, the more effective the collective heating. This required different social dynamics around privacy and personal space. But the thermal advantages were undeniable. Clothing innovations complemented architectural ones. Norse wool was processed differently than European wool. Deliberately kept coarser and oilier, making it more water-resistant and wind-resistant. This mattered enormously for people who needed to function outdoors in harsh conditions. Their layered clothing systems could be adjusted for indoor and outdoor wear. Heavy outer layers removed inside, but base layers, providing continuous insulation. Fur linings in strategic places, hoods, cuffs. anywhere coal could penetrate. Norse sagas describe winter activities we'd consider impossible. Ocean voyages conducted through winter storms. Overland travel through deep snow. Raids launched in conditions that medieval Europeans would have considered certain death. Archaeological findings from preserved Norse sites confirm these weren't exaggerations. Ship burials show vessels clearly used in extreme weather. Trade goods from winter journeys. Evidence of continuous activity rather than seasonal hibernation. Cultural attitudes reveal something fascinating. Norse peoples didn't just endure winter, they embraced it to some degree. Winter sports evolved. Festivals occurred. Activities continued. They developed cultural frameworks that made winter a season of different possibilities rather than pure survival challenge. This psychological adaptation was as important as technological innovation. Their success came from different foundational priorities. Medieval Europeans built stone castles optimized for defense, then struggled to keep them warm. Norse peoples built longhouses optimized for warmth retention, accepting vulnerability to attack that stone fortifications would have prevented. Different environmental pressures shape different solutions. When your primary threat is freezing rather than invasion, architecture reflects that calculus. The Norse adapted to extreme cold by redesigning their buildings and social structures. But they lived in a cold climate permanently, evolving solutions over generations. What about people who lived in moderate climates but faced winter extremes they weren't adapted for? What if you could build a fire once in the afternoon and still be warm at 3 in the morning? Eastern Europeans figured it out. They didn't just store food for winter. They stored heat itself in walls of stone and clay. Eastern Europe faced different challenges than Western Europe or Scandinavia. Continental climate meant extremes in both directions. Summers that could be brutally hot, winters that could be lethally cold. Rapid seasonal transitions gave little time for gradual adaptation. Buildings and cultural practices had to accommodate both extremes rather than optimizing for one seasonal threat. Their revolutionary innovation was the masonry stove. Called pech in Russian, these structures bore little resemblance to Western European fireplaces. Instead of stone boxes with chimneys that vented most heat directly outside, Eastern European stoves were massive masonry constructions designed around a completely different principle. Thermal storage. The design was elegant. Thick walls of stone, brick, or clay formed a large structure, sometimes occupying significant floor space in a dwelling. Internal passages created labyrinthine paths for smoke and hot gases before they finally vented outside. This forced heat to transfer into the masonry itself rather than escaping immediately. The stove would be fired intensely for several hours during the day, heating the massive thermal mass to high temperatures. Then the fire would go out. But the heat remained, trapped in hundreds of pounds of masonry that released it slowly over 12 to 18 hours. The stove became a radiator, warming the dwelling continuously through the night without requiring constant fuel feeding or fire tending. The thermal efficiency was remarkable compared to Western fireplaces that demanded continuous feeding and still left rooms cold. The sleeping innovation this enabled was revolutionary. Platforms built on top of or immediately adjacent to these stoves allowed people to sleep in direct contact with radiant warmth. Not trapping body heat or supplementing it with hot stones that cooled quickly, but sleeping beside or on top of a massive heat reservoir that maintained steady temperature all night. Children often slept on top of the stove itself during the coldest months. Adults slept on adjacent platforms or benches that absorbed radiant heat. This changed the survival equation fundamentally. Instead of maximizing heat retention from body warmth alone, Eastern European households generated surplus heat during the day and stored it for night use. The technology decoupled heat generation from heat availability, solving the problem Western Europeans never quite managed: how to stay warm when fires couldn't be safely maintained through sleeping hours. Communal living patterns still mattered. Extended families living together, multiple generations sharing single dwellings, maximized both heat sharing and resource pooling. But the masonry stove meant these households could be more self-sufficient than Western European equivalents. They didn't depend as heavily on tight community clustering for survival. Evidence appears in Russian chronicles describing household arrangements, Polish documents detailing construction practices, and archaeological findings from preserved medieval Eastern European sites. The stoves' remains are unmistakable: massive masonry foundations that dominated dwelling footprints. Their ubiquity suggests how central they were to survival strategy. These stoves were so effective they influenced settlement patterns. Villages could be smaller and more dispersed because individual households achieved thermal self-sufficiency. Western European peasants needed tight village clustering for mutual support. Eastern European households with proper masonry stoves could survive more independently, allowing different social and spatial organization. The technology spread slowly westward over centuries, but never fully replaced Western methods. Masonry stoves required significant expertise to construct properly. Materials weren't always available. Existing building stock represented enormous investment that couldn't be easily abandoned. Cultural traditions around fire and heating were deeply embedded. Technology transfer isn't just about recognizing better solutions. It requires infrastructure, knowledge, and willingness to abandon familiar practices. Northern peoples developed solutions for extreme cold. But winter affects even places we think of as mild. What about the Mediterranean regions? Did they face their own winter challenges? Medieval Romans wore wool and huddled near braziers in winter, shivering in buildings designed for summer heat. Sometimes it's not how cold it gets, it's how unprepared you are. We imagine Mediterranean winters as mild, almost pleasant. Sunny days, comfortable temperatures, nothing like the brutal conditions Northern Europeans faced. The reality was more complicated. Medieval Rome, Athens, Jerusalem, and other Mediterranean cities did face winter cold. Perhaps not the extreme temperatures of Scandinavia or Eastern Europe, but serious enough to require active survival strategies. Winter temperatures in these regions regularly dropped to freezing at night. Daytime might be moderate, but darkness brought genuine cold. The challenge was amplified by architecture designed for completely different conditions. Mediterranean buildings were optimized for summer cooling. Thick stone walls that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it inward during cool nights. High ceilings that allowed hot air to rise away from living spaces. Courtyards open to air circulation. Tile floors that stayed cool underfoot. These same features that made summer bearable made winter miserable. Stone walls absorbed cold and radiated it inward. High ceilings meant heat concentrated far above where people actually lived. Open courtyards created drafts. Tile floors were ice against bare feet. The buildings became cold traps. Mediterranean people developed specific adaptations. Braziers, portable charcoal-burning heaters, were ubiquitous. Unlike permanent fireplaces or stoves, braziers could move to whatever room needed heating at the moment. This flexibility suited buildings with multiple rooms and changing usage patterns. The charcoal provided relatively clean burning heat, without the smoke problems of wood fires in poorly ventilated spaces. Bedding priorities differed too. Lighter covers than northern climates required, but more of them, creating adjustable layers that could be added or removed as temperatures fluctuated through the night. Mediterranean winter wasn't consistently cold. It oscillated, requiring flexibility rather than maximum insulation. Some wealthy homes maintained Roman heating technology through the medieval period. Hypocausts, systems of underground channels carrying hot air from furnaces to warm floors from below. This technology was expensive to build and maintain, limiting it to the very wealthy, but its persistence suggests winter cold was serious enough to justify the investment. Clothing followed similar patterns to northern regions, despite different materials. More linen, less heavy wool, but still layered systems. The principle remained: trap air, manage moisture, adjust as conditions changed. Even moderate cold required active management. Mediterranean medical texts complained extensively about winter illnesses, respiratory problems, joint pain, conditions we now recognize as cold-related, despite the relatively moderate temperatures. Household inventories from Mediterranean estates show substantial investment in winter heating equipment: braziers, special winter bedding, heavy curtains for doorways and windows. This equipment mattered enough to be recorded and valued. The key insight is that cold is relative. What matters isn't absolute temperature, but the gap between what your body and culture are adapted to and what you're experiencing. A Mediterranean person adapted to mild climate wearing light clothing in buildings designed for cooling could suffer as much at 40 degrees as a Norse person suffered at 20 degrees. Neither was trivial discomfort. Both required survival strategies. Medieval Californians, essentially. Their moderate cold could be genuinely miserable, sometimes dangerous, even if it wasn't the lethal threat that northern winter represented. They still needed heating, still needed winter bedding, still needed cultural practices around surviving the cold season. Winter survival strategies were universal across Europe and the Mediterranean. The specifics varied enormously. Masonry stoves versus braziers, reindeer pelts versus layered linen, communal longhouses versus courtyard homes with portable heating. But the need for active management of cold existed everywhere. No one simply ignored winter and survived. So across Europe and beyond, in different climates and cultures, people faced winter darkness and cold. They developed solutions, some similar, some unique. It took humans 10,000 years to figure out how to survive winter nights. It took 100 years of central heating to make us forget everything they learned. We won the war against winter so completely that we don't even remember we fought it. The timeline of forgetting is remarkably compressed. Early 19th century innovations in cast iron stoves and coal furnaces began the transformation. These weren't the open hearths or masonry stoves of earlier eras. They were engineered heating devices that burned fuel efficiently and distributed heat effectively through metal surfaces and ductwork. Wealthy homes and public buildings adopted them first, gaining reliable winter heating for the first time in human history. Late 19th century brought central heating systems, furnaces in basements pushing warm air through the buildings via ducts and vents. Initially exclusive to the very wealthy, these systems represented fundamental shift. Heat could be generated centrally and distributed everywhere. No need for fires in individual rooms. No need for constant tending. Just mechanical reliability and fossil fuel abundance. Early 20th century saw middle-class adoption. Central heating spread from mansions to ordinary homes in developed nations. Coal furnaces, then oil, then natural gas and electric systems. Each iteration more convenient, more reliable, more effective at maintaining constant comfortable temperatures regardless of outdoor conditions. Post-World War II brought near-universal installation in wealthy countries. Within 1 or 2 decades, heated homes became the default expectation rather than luxury. By the 1970s, virtually every new home in developed nations included central heating as standard feature. Thermostats replaced fire tending. Mechanical systems replaced human knowledge. Within just 3 to 4 generations, roughly 100 years, winter went from existential threat to minor inconvenience. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that cultural memory couldn't keep pace. We lost more than just the need for survival strategies. We lost the knowledge itself. First, practical knowledge became unnecessary and stopped being transmitted. Why teach children about strategic layering, bed warming, or thermal management when you have a thermostat? The information had no utility. Parents didn't bother teaching what seemed irrelevant. Schools certainly didn't cover it. Within a single generation, knowledge that had been universal became rare. Then cultural memory faded. The generation that remembered cold winters, people born in the late 1800s who'd experienced life before reliable heating, died off through the mid-20th century. Their children had partial memories, perhaps recalling cold childhoods before their families installed heating. But those children's children knew only heated homes. No personal reference point for what indoor cold actually meant. Finally came complete disconnection. Modern people in developed nations have never experienced sustained indoor cold. They literally cannot imagine it. When power outages occur and heating fails, the shock is profound. A few hours of cold feels catastrophic because there's no framework for understanding it as normal, manageable, survivable. We've become physiologically and psychologically dependent on mechanical heating to a degree we don't recognize until it fails. The psychological shift was profound. Winter changed from something you survived to something you experienced aesthetically through windows while inside controlled environments. Snow became pretty rather than threatening. Cold became an outdoor phenomenon you briefly encountered between heated car and heated building. The existential edge disappeared entirely. Evidence of this transformation appears everywhere. Household management texts from the 1800s extensively discuss winter preparation, heating management, and cold weather survival. By the early 1900s, these sections were shrinking. By mid-century, they'd vanished almost entirely. Modern household guides don't mention winter survival because the concept seems absurd. Architecture changed radically. Once heating technology could generate unlimited heat, design priorities shifted. Larger windows letting in light without concern for heat loss. higher ceilings creating volume without thermal penalty, less insulation because mechanical systems could compensate. Buildings designed, assuming reliable heating, would always be available. Literature and art began romanticizing winter. Once it stopped being threatening, it became aesthetic. Pretty snow, cozy firesides, winter a season of beauty rather than danger. This romanticization was only possible because actual winter threat had been eliminated for the people producing and consuming this culture. The paradox is striking. Just as we gained complete victory over winter cold, we lost all memory of how people survived without that victory. We can't imagine life before central heating because we've never experienced it. Medieval winter survival feels alien, almost fantastical, when it was simply normal life for the vast majority of human history. This isn't just nostalgia or trivial historical curiosity. We've lost practical knowledge that remains valuable. Power outages happen. Heating systems fail. Emergency situations arise. People in developed nations can die from cold in their own homes during extended outages because they have no knowledge of basic thermal management. The survival strategies medieval people mastered could still save lives, but we've forgotten them. We've also lost cultural understanding of our own ancestors. Medieval life feels incomprehensible, partly because we can't imagine being perpetually cold. That barrier of understanding separates us from accurate historical empathy. But the physical knowledge of survival wasn't all we lost. We also lost something psychological, an understanding of darkness, cold, and sleep that shaped human consciousness for millennia. Medieval people's brains worked differently than yours. Not because they were different, but because darkness and cold literally change human consciousness. We eliminated those conditions. Did we eliminate part of our humanity too? Modern humans experience fundamentally different neurological states than our medieval ancestors. Not through biological evolution. 100 years is insignificant on evolutionary timescales, but through environmental transformation. We've eliminated the conditions that shaped human consciousness for thousands of years. The consequences are more profound than we realize. Start with darkness. Medieval people spent roughly half their lives in complete or near complete darkness. Modern humans almost never experience it. Light pollution bleaches night skies. Streetlights glow outside windows. Screens illuminate faces until sleep. LED indicators shine from every device. Even when we think we're in darkness, we're in dim light that's bright by historical standards. True darkness triggers specific neurological responses. Melatonin production increases dramatically. Circadian rhythms synchronize to natural light cycles. The visual cortex, starved of input, begins generating its own. The hypnagogic visions medieval people interpreted as supernatural. Brainwave patterns shift. Consciousness enters states that are now unusual, but were once nightly occurrences. We've eliminated these triggers. Modern melatonin production is suppressed by artificial light. Circadian rhythms become desynchronized. We don't experience the altered consciousness states that darkness naturally produces. Medieval people's visions weren't just cultural interpretation. They were neurological reality we no longer access. Cold creates similarly profound effects. Sustained cold exposure alters metabolic rates, hormone production, and neural activity. Medieval people spent months in conditions cold enough to trigger these changes. Their bodies operated differently than ours do in climate-controlled environments. Brown fat activation, different thyroid function, altered stress hormone patterns, all responses to cold that modern heated life prevents. Sleep patterns reveal the deepest changes. Biphasic sleep, first sleep, wakeful interval, second sleep, was human default for millennia. Modern research has proven this definitively. When researchers place people in environments without artificial lighting, mimicking medieval conditions, participants naturally develop biphasic patterns within weeks. They're not learning something new. They're returning to something ancient. This means medieval people weren't experiencing abnormal sleep. We are. Their biphasic pattern wasn't cultural preference. It was biological default we've trained ourselves out of through artificial lighting that extends our active days and compresses our sleep into shorter windows. Modern sleep disorders might partly reflect this mismatch in insomnia, fragmented sleep, midnight waking that we pathologize and medicate. These could be natural biphasic sleep trying to assert itself against environmental conditions that suppress it. We treat as disorder what might be normal human neurology, protesting abnormal circumstances. Seasonal affective disorder similarly might reflect mismatch between ancient wiring and modern environment. Medieval people experienced dramatic seasonal variation in light, activity, and consciousness. Their psychology adapted cyclically. We try to maintain constant states year-round under artificial conditions. The ancient patterns persist in our neurology, but can't express normally. Creating distress we label as disorder. Research on populations living without electricity confirms these patterns. Some Amish communities maintaining traditional lifestyles show sleep and consciousness patterns remarkably similar to historical populations. Rural developing world populations without grid access naturally exhibit biphasic sleep. Research participants housed in conditions mimicking pre-electric environments rapidly develop medieval neurological patterns. This raises profound questions. Have we advanced or just eliminated environmental inputs that shaped human consciousness for its entire evolutionary history? Are we healthier psychologically or just adapted to abnormal conditions while losing access to states that were once normal? Medieval people's psychological experiences, their relationship to darkness, their sense of time, their visions and altered states weren't primitive or superstitious. They were neurologically real, produced by environments that triggered responses still coded in our brains but rarely activated. We've gained climate control and defeated winter. We've gained artificial light and eliminated darkness. But consciousness isn't infinitely plastic. It evolved in specific environments. Removing those environments doesn't make consciousness disappear. It makes it express strangely, creating experiences we don't understand because we've forgotten what normal human neurology looks like under natural conditions. We've lost the knowledge and the consciousness. But there's one more loss that matters. We've lost the respect for what our ancestors accomplished. Every person alive today is descended from someone who survived winter nights without central heating. They solved an impossible problem every single night for their entire lives. You exist because they figured it out. We've traveled through centuries of winter darkness together, explored stone chambers and enclosed beds, examined warming stones and layered wool, witnessed survival strategies that range from elegant to desperate, followed the thread of human ingenuity through cold that should have killed everyone it touched. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was the story of how humanity survived its environment long enough to eventually master it. Modern attitudes toward medieval people are often condescending. We imagine them as primitive, ignorant, simply suffering through conditions they couldn't improve. Victims waiting for the future to rescue them with technology they couldn't imagine. This documentary reveals something entirely different. Medieval people were sophisticated environmental engineers. They understood thermal dynamics intuitively. Heat rises, dead air insulates, mass stores energy. They grasped human physiology practically. Body heat as resource, communal warmth as multiplication, strategic positioning as a survival tool. They developed integrated systems where architecture, textiles, social organization, and cultural practices all reinforced each other toward one goal: surviving until spring. They weren't waiting for rescue. They were actively mastering their circumstances with available resources. The fact that their solutions look primitive to us reflects our advantages, not their inadequacy. They accomplished something remarkable. They survived conditions that would kill most modern people within days. This deserves respect. Not romanticization or pity, but genuine recognition of human capability. These people looked at winter, months of deadly cold, darkness, and scarcity, and refused to surrender. They experimented, innovated, adapted, and transmitted knowledge across generations until survival became reliable enough that population could grow despite seasonal mortality. Consider this personally. Every single person watching or reading this descended from people who survived hundreds of winter nights using these exact techniques. This isn't distant ancient history. This is recent. Your great-great-great-grandparents might have slept in enclosed beds, wearing wool layers, sharing body heat with family members. Your ancestors heated stones by their fires and placed them in their beds. They woke during the night to check on children, adjust coverings, ensure everyone still breathed. They succeeded. Night after night, winter after winter, year after year. They survived long enough to have children who survived long enough to eventually lead to you. You exist because anonymous ancestors mastered problems you've never had to consider. Your comfortable modern sleep rests on foundations built by people who fought for every warm hour. Understanding this history isn't about rejecting modernity or romanticizing hardship. It's about recognizing what humans are capable of when necessity demands it. It's about connection to experiences that shaped our species psychologically and culturally in ways we still carry but no longer understand. When medieval people said goodnight to each other in winter, they weren't being casual. They were genuinely wishing for survival through dangerous hours ahead. Sleep wasn't routine, it was accomplishment. Waking to sunrise meant victory over circumstances that claimed others. Every morning was evidence of successful survival, of knowledge applied correctly, of community functioning adequately, of luck holding one more night. Modern people who've never experienced that precarity have lost connection to fundamental human experiences. We've lost the visceral understanding that survival requires effort, knowledge, community, and constant vigilance. We've gained comfort, but lost something else: the recognition of what it takes to simply exist in an environment that wants to kill you. So we've explored the past, the methods, the struggles, the victories. But what does any of this mean now? What do we do with this knowledge in a world where thermostats and electric blankets have made it irrelevant? The next time your power goes out in winter, You're not facing a modern crisis. You're facing a medieval Tuesday. And now you know exactly what to do. This isn't just interesting history. It's potentially life-saving knowledge for situations that happen with increasing frequency. Power outages during winter storms are becoming more common as climate change stresses infrastructure in new ways. Heating systems fail. Emergency situations arise. Or perhaps you're choosing to reduce heating costs or environmental impact. Medieval winter survival techniques remain remarkably relevant. The principles translate directly. Layering works identically whether you're wearing medieval wool or modern synthetic fabrics. The physics hasn't changed. Multiple thin layers trap air between them, creating insulation through dead space. One thick blanket keeps you less warm than 3 thinner blankets, accomplishing the same total thickness because of the air layers between them. Curtaining off unused rooms concentrates their body heat in smaller spaces. The exact same logic medieval people used with bed curtains, just scaled to room level. During heating failures, abandon most of your home. Choose one room, preferably smaller and interior, preferably one where multiple people can gather. Hang blankets over doorways. Block body drafts. Create a microclimate you can actually warm with body heat alone. Sleeping in warmer clothing reduces heating needs dramatically. Modern people resist this because we associate undressing with bedtime. But that's cultural conditioning from heated homes. Wear clean, comfortable layers to sleep. Your body's 100 watts of heat will work more effectively keeping you warm rather than heating empty air around you. Hot water bottles are modern equivalents of medieval warming stones. Fill them before bed, place them strategically under covers, and they'll provide hours of supplemental warmth. Electric heating pads work similarly. Heat them before sleep, then turn them off. The residual warmth lasts. You're using stored heat rather than continuous energy consumption. During major winter emergencies, people instinctively rediscover medieval knowledge. Texas's 2021 winter storm saw families huddling together in single rooms, piling on blankets, sleeping in layers. They were unconsciously applying thousand-year-old survival strategies. European winter power crises, northeastern US ice storms, the same patterns emerged. People survive by clustering, layering, concentrating real resources, exactly as medieval households did. Practical modern applications are straightforward. If heating fails, immediately implement warm room strategy. Choose your warmest room, smallest interior space available. Move everyone there. Bring blankets, sleeping materials, food and water for several hours. Hang blankets or sheets over doorways and windows to create dead air barriers. Body heat from multiple people in a small sealed space can maintain survivable temperature even when the rest of your home approaches freezing. Optimal sleeping arrangements for emergency cold follow medieval logic. Multiple people together sharing covers. Children positioned between adults. Most vulnerable individuals in center positions where they benefit from heat on multiple sides. Everyone wearing layers. Maximum blankets piled on top, with heaviest blankets outermost to trap warm air underneath. Calculate needed insulation based on temperature. Each blanket layer provides roughly 5 to 7 degrees of warmth retention. If your room is 45 degrees and you need 70-degree sleeping conditions, you need approximately 4 to 5 blanket layers plus body heat. Add people sharing that microclimate, and the equation shifts. Each additional person reduces required blanket layers. Sustainability advocates can use these strategies voluntarily. Reduce thermostat settings significantly while maintaining comfort through medieval techniques. Sleep cold but comfortable. Heater your body, not your whole house. One modern household heating to 70 degrees consumes vastly more energy than medieval household maintaining 60-degree space through insulation and body heat clustering. You can choose to live somewhere between, perhaps 65 degrees, with strategic layering and room concentration during sleep hours. This isn't about suffering or romanticizing hardship. It's about having options. You're not helpless if modern systems fail. You carry ancestral knowledge. You now understand it explicitly. You can implement it immediately if circumstances require. But beyond practical preparation, there's something else this history offers us. A different way of thinking about hardship, community, and what it means to be human. Medieval people didn't have the option to avoid cold, darkness, or discomfort. So they developed psychological resilience we've lost. What if some of our modern suffering comes from being too comfortable? Modern life has created expectations that are historically anomalous. We expect constant comfort, controllable environments, individual autonomy without dependence on others. Any deviation from these expectations feels like crisis requiring immediate correction. Medieval people had completely different psychological frameworks. They expected hardship, accepted interdependence, understood that some challenges required endurance rather than solutions. This difference matters more than we realize. Modern anxiety might partly stem from unrealistic expectations that everything should be comfortable and controllable. Medieval people accepted that winter was simply hard. No amount of preparation made it comfortable. Success meant survival, not pleasure. That acceptance, the recognition that some circumstances just are difficult and must be endured, created different psychological responses than our modern expectation that discomfort signals something wrong requiring fixing. Medieval people couldn't afford anxiety about whether winter would be hard. It would be, energy went toward managing it rather than resenting it. Modern people, conditioned to believe discomfort is abnormal, experience anxiety when encountering unavoidable challenges. We've lost the psychological frameworks for accepting hardship as normal, rather than as failure of control. Modern loneliness connects to our abandonment of necessary interdependence. Medieval people literally needed each other to survive winter. Community bonds weren't optional social preferences, they were survival infrastructure. You maintained relationships because your life might depend on them. Modern autonomy has benefits, certainly, but it's eliminated the forced interdependence that created tight social networks. We can survive alone, but perhaps we're not psychologically equipped for that isolation. Modern sleep problems might relate to environments that are too controlled and artificial. Medieval people's sleep was shaped by natural darkness, temperature variation, and circadian rhythms synchronized to actual day-night cycles. Our artificially lit, climate-controlled, screen-filled environments override natural sleep architecture. We've gained comfort but possibly lost sleep quality by eliminating the environmental inputs our neurology evolved to respond to. This isn't advocating return to medieval conditions. Suffering isn't inherently valuable, but it suggests we can learn from medieval psychological frameworks. The acceptance that not everything needs fixing or optimizing. The recognition that community support isn't weakness, but evolutionary strategy. The understanding that our bodies and minds adapted to challenges we've now eliminated, possibly at some cost. Modern research on hormetic stress reveals something fascinating. Small amounts of challenge and discomfort actually strengthen us psychologically and physiologically. Complete elimination of stress does not optimize health. It creates fragility. Medieval people lived with constant hormetic stress. Cold exposure, hunger between meals, darkness, physical labor. Their bodies and minds were constantly challenged at levels that triggered adaptive responses rather than damage. We've eliminated nearly all hormetic stress. Climate control, abundant food, artificial light, sedentary work, physical comfort is constant. But our biology still expects challenges. The absence might weaken rather than strengthen us. This explains growing interest in practices that voluntarily reintroduce challenges. Cold exposure therapy. Deliberately exposing yourself to cold to trigger adaptive responses. Darkness retreats. Spending time in complete darkness to reset circadian rhythms and experience altered consciousness states. Digital detoxes. Removing artificial light and screens to allow natural sleep patterns to pace. Intermittent fasting. Recreating the meal spacing medieval people experienced by necessity. These aren't masochism. They're attempts to provide bodies with inputs they evolved to handle and might actually need. Some practitioners report significant psychological benefits. Better sleep, reduced anxiety, improved mood, enhanced resilience. Not because suffering is good, but because strategic, controlled discomfort might activate systems that atrophy when everything is comfortable. People are voluntarily experimenting with medieval-like conditions, sleeping in cold rooms with heavy blankets rather than heated spaces, reducing artificial light to experience natural darkness, attempting biphasic sleep patterns. The results are mixed. Not everyone benefits, and individual variation matters. But enough people report improvements that the phenomenon deserves attention. Medieval people didn't have choices about these conditions. We do. We can intentionally incorporate elements that might strengthen us while maintaining modern safety and medicine. We can learn from their resilience without romanticizing their suffering. We can recognize that human psychology evolved in challenging environments and might function better with some strategic challenge than with complete comfort. So, medieval winter survival offers us practical knowledge and psychological insight. But there's one final gift it gives us: a story. And stories matter. Tonight, somewhere, someone will fall asleep in the cold. Maybe they're camping, maybe their heating failed, maybe they chose it. And whether they know it or not, they're connected to millions of people who did the same thing, night after night, century after century, until it became your story too. Return to that medieval castle at 2 in the morning. The fire has died to embers. Outside, January wind howls against stone walls 3 feet thick. Inside, in the great chamber, a bed stands enclosed by heavy wool curtains, drawn tight against the cold. But now we understand what's happening inside those curtains. 4 people sleep together. Parents, 2 children. Each body generating 100 watts of heat. 400 watts total, concentrated in a space roughly the size of a modern queen bed. At their feet, River stones wrapped in wool still release warmth absorbed from the afternoon fire. The stones cooled from scalding to merely warm hours ago, but they're still warmer than the surrounding air, still contributing. Everyone wears layers. Linen shifts against skin, wicking moisture. Wool, nightshirts over those trapping air. The mother wears a nightcap. The children are positioned between adults, maximizing their access to body heat. Above them, wool blankets piled deep, 4, 5 layers, with the heaviest outermost, creating air pockets that prevent the heat they're generating from escaping into the frigid room beyond the curtains. 3 hours ago, they went to sleep. Now, the father's eyes open. Not from alarm or distress, just natural waking between first and second sleep. He lies quiet for a moment, assessing. Everyone breathes, steadily. The air inside the curtains feels close, but not suffocating. The strategic gaps they left are working. He reaches down to adjust blankets that shifted during sleep, ensuring his daughter's feet remain covered. She stirs but doesn't wake. He considers rising to check the fire, decides against it. The embers will last until dawn. No point exposing himself to the cold or disturbing the careful thermal balance they've created. In an hour, he'll return to sleep. For now, he simply exists in the dark, aware of his family's warmth around him, listening to the wind that can't reach them, waiting for sleep to return. This scene repeated millions of times across centuries. Every winter night, in every region where cold could kill, people implemented these strategies. It wasn't usually dramatic, it was routine. Small victories multiplied across populations and generations, until they become the foundation of survival itself. This documentary has been about sleep, yes, but really it's been about human adaptation, about ingenuity and community, about looking at an environment actively trying to kill you and refusing to surrender. Medieval people faced winter darkness and cold with nothing but wool, stone, fire, and each other. They figured out not just how to survive, but how to build cultures, create art, raise children, conduct trade, wage wars, write poetry, and pass down knowledge. They did all of this while fighting a battle against cold every single night for months, every single year. You are their descendant. You carry their genetics. You carry, perhaps, more of their psychology than you realize. Neural pathways shaped by darkness and cold. Circadian rhythms coded for biphasic sleep. Resilience written into your stress response systems. The capacity to survive is in you, because they survived long enough to pass it forward. Tonight, you'll sleep in your heated home, under light blankets, probably alone. You'll set a thermostat to maintain comfortable temperature while you're unconscious. You'll fall asleep with artificial light from screen still glowing in your peripheral vision. You'll sleep through the night in a single block. And if you wake at 3 a.m., you'll probably consider it a sleep problem rather than natural biology. This would have been unimaginable luxury to 99% of humans who ever lived. Medieval people would have considered your ordinary Tuesday night to be paradise. Never discount the victory you've inherited, the complete triumph over winter that thousands of generations fought toward but never achieved. But perhaps occasionally, when you're comfortable in that heated room, it's worth remembering. You also possess the knowledge and the genetic heritage to survive without any of it. You come from survivors. Thousands of years of winter nights are written in your bones. Understanding this history doesn't necessarily change your daily life. But maybe it changes how you see yourself, not just as an individual in the present, but as a link in a chain of human resilience that stretches back through countless cold nights into deep history. And maybe, just maybe, that matters. Good night. May you sleep warm.